Sorry, which is waiting to go live.
I believe we are. Nikhil, Arun, could you confirm that?
We're live.
We're live, Nikhil. You can go ahead.
Thanks. So, so the first session is going to focus on the impact of the IT rules and intermediaries, and we'll look into how into the functioning of intermediaries in general and how it's impacted, not just social media intermediaries. To start off with, I'd like to ask Urvashi. Urvashi Aneja is the founding director of Tandem Research, which has done some great work on platform power. Now with a global political environment sort of leading, essentially pushing back against platforms and their power, the IT rules seem to be addressing some parts of it. And while there has been a focus on using competition regulation in most places, one would think that greater restrictions for large entities such as social media intermediaries would impact platform power. So, Urvashi, how do the rules impact platform power? Do they cement the power of large platforms, or do they diffuse it, and will they allow for greater competition now?
Thanks, Nikhil. Thanks for inviting me. I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So if I drop out or if I freeze, just wave or something. And delighted to see so many people on this call. I'm sure many of us are experiencing really tough times. I also wasn't sure whether I'd be able to make it. But to be honest, just to see what an important role platforms like Twitter and Facebook are currently playing and allowing people to help each other and get what they need. I think it kind of drove home, at least for me, the need to kind of bring a balanced perspective to this conversation. So let me just start by, to respond to your question on do they respond to platform power? I think it's helpful maybe to just point out that not all platforms are the same. It's probably not a good idea to try and regulate all platforms the same way. In some of our work, we make a distinction between certain types of platforms. So we argue that certain types of platforms have taken on infrastructural properties, right? So they operate as public utilities. And so those kind of platforms, we probably need to regulate differently than we do from all platforms, right? Because I think there is a danger that if we focus on the big platforms and we club all our regulation around that, we could negatively impact the smaller ones, right? So I think with regard to the IT rules, there is a chance of that, or what I'm suggesting, playing out, where some of the requirements of platforms in terms of compliance with the rules are fairly stringent and they're quite intensive. And smaller platforms may not be able to or may be able to meet that bar, right? And so in that sense, they could end up crowding out the smaller platforms and in some sense increasing the power of the larger platforms. So, if you think of it like that, I think these rules, if the aim was to address the power of these big tech platforms, right, these big social media platforms, I'm not sure that they will effectively do that. And in some sense, you can think of like this question. So that's the bit about the platform, right? Like I think we need to disaggregate the conversation into different types.
But obviously they do create a distinction between large and between significant and non-significant intermediaries, right? So they seem to target the larger ones. Is that approach correct? I know the threshold might be a little bit low, but is the approach correct?
I'm not sure whether the user base is a sufficient approach. It might be one of the things that one wants to think about when one is trying to distinguish between various types of platforms. I would think that, I mean, in India, for an example, we already know, we have multiple people use single mobile phones, platforms like Facebook, you have business accounts, etc. So I'm not sure the user base is an adequate threshold. For me, what would be an adequate, when we, at least in our work, when we talk about certain platforms having infrastructural properties, what is relevant there is the extent to which other services are dependent on them, right? So you have a base layer and you have other services that are being built on top of it. So that to me then is an important way of thinking about infrastructure, not the user base alone. So it could be that that's part of it, but I don't think that's sufficient when we're thinking about it. So even so it could therefore mean that you could have platforms that have a really large user base, but they don't have that infrastructural property, right? So I think it's helpful to distinguish on those grounds. I think the second, if I kind of break up what you're saying, the other part of what you're saying is the power bit. And even there, I think it's helpful to kind of disaggregate that concept a little bit. So you could have power to make your own decisions, right? That's one way that we can have power, and you could have power to influence other things. So if you look at power in terms of making your own decisions, then I think some of the rules do curtail the decision-making agency of these large platforms, right? So in those sense, they rein them in. But I think the concern with some of these platforms has been around what impact they have or on the online space, right? Is the online space safe? Do they address online violence? So that's about the power they have over others, right? And that I don't think has been addressed. So both on the platform and the power bit, I think it's helpful to disaggregate it to be able to identify what the IT rules do and do not do.
But I mean, look, are there, so I understand you're saying that this cements platform power. Are there means of addressing online harms without cementing platform power?
Yeah, I think they are. I think one of the main reasons that we see, and I'm restricting my comments here to kind of the social media and content moderation kind of space, right? I mean, like you mentioned in your opening remarks, we see in many other geographies that competition policy and other tools are being used to address platform power. And I think those are really, really important. And that's where we should be focusing our attention. But to turn to the specific social media context, I think one of the reasons that platforms, that we see online harms and we see certain practices that are maybe not are contrary to rights, so on, is because of the way these platforms are structured, right? So I would like to see much more energy on being able to audit their algorithms, to being able to check the kind of amplification that is enabled by their algorithms. And these algorithms are optimized to increase increase the extent to which you're hooked onto these platforms, right? They're optimized to spread sensational content, right? Or they're optimized to at least spread content that gets more eyeballs, right? So I would like to see much more attention on that part of it if we're trying to address platform power. And in some sense, using and just saying that, and using, for an example, AI for content moderation, I think in fact increases platform power, because that AI content moderation is happening in an opaque way. It's a black box. We don't really know what is happening in that black box, right? So I think looking at the algorithmic amplification part is a more effective way to address the harms produced by these platforms in the social media space. And that's where I think we should be investing our energy.
Thanks, Urvashi. Harshita, Harshita is the general counsel for Xiaomi, and Xiaomi is a fairly significant intermediary. It's probably the most popular handset company in India, and it has its own operating system, its own messaging. It has payment services, a lending app, and so much more. I mean, my first Xiaomi app had its own app store, and that's because I picked up the device in China. But you know, there's so many roles that Xiaomi plays. How are you impacted by these roles, Harshita? And do you think that the net has been cast wide enough to cover all roles?
Hi everyone. Thanks, Nikhil, for having me. To answer your question, yes, we are, impacted by these rules. However, not as bad as a platform like WhatsApp a pure messaging platform or a social networking platform is. That's because of the way we interpret, the internet intermediaries as well as the social intermediary definitions in the rules. So the way we have categorized ourselves is pure intermediaries, which is internet intermediaries, where there are apps that function exactly like a tech platform, enabling to users to communicate. And then we talk about platforms where there is some user interaction in the sense that there is actually enabling interaction like our messaging platform, though it is, I would say, the most unused part of our platform, and thank God for that. I mean, otherwise it would really push us into becoming the significant social intermediary. So
but
because
to that extent, isn't your UPI service covered?
So there, if you look at the definition of significant or social intermediary or social intermediary, it talks about primarily or solely enabling interaction. So these apps that we have, they have a different function. And yes, they do have a chat facility where you can communicate, etc. But that is not enabling two users to communicate with each other. In a lot of instances, we communicate with, and look at the definition of user in this case. I know it is vague, but at the end of the day, because they are so vague and because we have to run a business, we are giving a reasonable interpretation to the words we are reading into these definitions and narrowing it down to suit our, business purposes as well.
Right, so, but Harshita, the word interaction, and just to read the definition out, a social media intermediary means an intermediary which primarily or solely enables online interaction between two or more users and allows them to create, upload, share, disseminate, modify, or access information using its services.
Yeah.
So with that broad definition, effectively a transaction is also an interaction. If everything is bits and bytes, even a transaction is uploading of information, right? Or it's sharing information.
Yeah, so, if you look at the definition of user, there is enough ambiguity. Is this user, are we talking about the scope of this user as an individual user versus, entities? So most of our users, especially on these platforms that you just spoke about, MeitY, MeitCredit, etc., they are actually talking to institutions. They are talking to entities, as opposed to, talking to two people, as opposed to a messaging platform where you and I are having a conversation through a messaging platform. So, and so the role there is limited. And that is how we want to sort of give it a narrow definition. Otherwise, this is a very unruly horse. Because firstly, the definition of intermediaries is so vast and expanse that it pretty much covers everything. Like the other day, I was speaking to you about how you were telling me about how OS can be a intermediary, and I was telling you how that's a different discussion altogether about how to hold OS not an intermediary, etc. So when it comes to this, we have to at some point, because these regulations just came one fine day and they became effective almost immediately the next day, right? I think they came around 24th and 25th of Feb is when they were notified in the Gazette.
Yes.
So it barely gave us time to sort of digest, to study the implications, etc. And the way businesses and the corporates work, you just can't like shut your business because the particular rules have not understood, and they've not had consultation to sort of understand how the businesses work, what the scope should have been of the rules, etc. So it's really vague and ambiguous, and to that extent, what we need to do is what we need to do, in the sense, so again, there are two ways to look at it, in my opinion. Are we ensuring that the diligence norms that they've set out in 3 are complied with? Yes, we are doing that. That's something that we already did, because the old rules also pretty much said the same thing, except of course for the timelines and the grievance redressal mechanism. And that's something that we pretty much easily put in place. That was not so much of an issue. But if you really look at the application of some of these definitions, these are really vague and ambiguous. And I really subscribe to the view that most of these things were really unintentional. Classic case is we have an internal business communication platform, like an internal employee communication platform. And we certainly believe that these rules must not apply to this, even though technically it does, allow us to interact, it allows two employees to interact, etc. This is a very closed system. I'm not putting these services, or I'm not making this platform available to everyone, and a lot of confidential information, is discussed. And it is not even a platform which is allowed for downloading, like Slack or Flock, etc. Right? So, at the end of the day, because, this is not gone in for judicial interpretation, and the definitions are so vague and vast, we have given it a very reasonable interpretation as far as our implementation is concerned.
But Harshita, that's your interpretation, right? In the sense, if you go back to the 66A 79A case that was being heard in the Supreme Court, I mean, intermediaries were seen as everything from an ISP to an operating system to a gateway to. So effectively, an intermediary is
it's pretty much everyone.
It's pretty much everyone that's not producing or publishing content. So that effectively brings everyone into the ambit, unless there is a narrowing of that scope or a narrowing of the definition. It basically encompasses even an operating system. I mean, that's just my thinking around it. It's not that the government will try to maybe designate an operating system as a significant social media intermediary, but by definition, even an operating system is a social media intermediary because of how broad the definition is.
Like I said, I beg to differ. I mean, we did have this discussion about how I think mobile OSs will not be a social media intermediary, because it is, while it is a platform, but it is not an interaction, because, it's you on one side and a hardware phone or a system on the other side. So at the best, I would think it's an infrastructure on which various apps and various intermediaries can exist.
So in just the last question to you before I bring Shekhar in,
sure.
How can this definition be narrowed according to you?
I think this is not a very easy answer, because, when we given the role of intermediaries, and given that this is very, the whole purpose of why we have this definition of intermediary is because we have immunity in terms of section 79, right? So this is not a very easy answer, to the extent that you need to speak to a lot of people, a lot of business members, and come across a sort of a solution that sort of restricts the definition of intermediary in the first place, or regulate different intermediaries under different pieces of legislation. Like, for instance, I know that this is not part of the scope of this discussion. The OTT platforms, in my opinion, should not be brought under the IT Act, right? So, either regulate it separately, or, you have a very intelligent definition of intermediary through a consultation process. Because we have had this definition for a long time, people have had their views. So the thing is, you call for consultations, have a discussion, and then come up with an intelligent definition as far as intermediary is concerned. Take a look at various functions the intermediaries perform. Like, for instance, having in my opinion, the B2B intermediaries must totally be kept out from these rules.
And that's a change in definition that took place. Shekhar, thanks for joining us. Yours is another large and very, very significant intermediary with intermediary businesses across roles, and that's probably increased even more with Office 365. So what challenges do you see with the current definition of intermediaries, or with the definition of significant social media intermediaries?
Yeah, as Harshita had mentioned, the definition as it currently stands is a little broad and tries to encompass a lot of things which are probably not intended. And we are also in the process of compiling various questions and gray areas, which we will take back to the ministry, but we want to take it from the angle of the difficulty of interpretation and the difficulty of implementation. That said, you can slice and dice this problem in various ways. One way of looking at it is that what is the ultimate objective? Ultimate objective is that harmful content should not flow. If it flows, the intermediary should be indemnified. And if the intermediary is notified, the content has to be removed. These are the three broad principles from which you can build up the entire edifice. That said, what will be an intermediary? Intermediary will necessarily be a very broad term covering your ISPs, covering your telecom networks and everything, because it is between two or three users. Now, whether the intermediary is dumb or whether the intermediary is interactive. And second, what is the degree of control that the user has over the content? So if we look at the problem like this, then the situation starts becoming a little more clearer. So let us take the case of an enterprise service. Suppose a service is, suppose I am corporation XYZ, I am using so and so platform for my employees to communicate. Now, before a person comes onto this platform, number one, an enterprise has bought it. The enterprise has got an agreement. Each and every person who is coming onto the platform is validated. The primary purpose of that platform, while there may be communication, collaboration, etc., the primary purpose is to do this thing. And if there is any harm, you have various layers at which you can arrest it. There have been cases where such enterprise networks also have been misused in the past, so you can arrest it. Now, if you contrast it with a slightly open platform, like we also have, Microsoft also has such platforms, there, number one, by the very nature of the platform, the entry barrier is very less. It is open for anybody. There is no vetting of who is coming and all that. If there is no sort of an administrator who is watching and policing what is going on. The intent of the communication can be multifaceted. You and I can speak about something, somebody else can speak about something else. If there is a harm, then there is a certain process to remove. If there is some harm which is happening, it becomes a little difficult for us to trace out, because there was no process ab initio, because the entire edifice and the entire platform was built on a different premise. So these are some pointers which lead us to how you can define a social media intermediary and a significant social media intermediary. Because, for example, you could be a startup who is starting a new app which has barely 100 users. That is not significant, both either in terms of its harm or in terms of its reach.
Well, if you look at, I mean, I think this number 5 million or 50 lakhs seems to be similar to Germany's next DG. And I was just thinking that 5 million in India is such an easy target for most apps to hit. And how is it going to be even be defined? Is it going to be monthly active users? Is it going to be registered users?
Yeah, so these are some of the areas where further clarity is required. So between registered,
because even when you look at it, there is no statistic that is adequately reliable. It's not like a telecom network where the operators tracks how many numbers they're selling, right? I'm not sure how this numbers even like how it will work.
From the point of view of a service provider, for us, it is not very difficult to get the monthly active users.
Hmm.
For total number of registered users, yes, it is not impossible, but then it becomes a little difficult. There are a lot of redundant kind of accounts which people just open and leave it. But monthly active users is not difficult to track down. So probably that will make more sense as a number.
You have no incentive to indicate that you've got more than 5 million. So that's the
Yes.
problem, right? So if you need third-party auditing, and the government would, I'm not sure how they can enforce this then, because how will they know? And of course, we've seen in the online advertising space, numbers quite often get fudged. So what if the platform goes and says, "But I have got, let's say 75% of the 5 million that you're claiming." How does the government audit this?
That's a good question and a fair.
So because I'm asking you these questions because you've been on the other side, right? You've been in government. So,
Yeah.
so what is the regulatory thinking behind taking this kind of an approach?
So see, there one needs to drive a fine balance between. Like I say, that you need to cast the net, but the net should not be so fine that while you want to catch the whales, it should not catch the shrimp also.
Hmm.
So it is definitely an arbitrary number. 5 lakhs would have been too less for a country like India. There was some discussion comparing such numbers with Germany, other geographies, trying to keep out the startups, trying to keep out entities which are not very big. And then this figure came. But this is not cast in stone. If it is found that it is too high, it's not catching anybody, the figure can come down. If it is found that it is too low, that everybody is getting caught, it could be increased.
So, Mr. Rakesh Maheshwari, who's been fairly instrumental in putting these rules together, had tweeted I think a week or so ago, asking if Skype is a significant, if Skype is a social media intermediary. Now, what effectively it falls under the definition. Do you think that Microsoft Teams and Skype will get impacted by these rules?
I do not think so, because again, we have to see the primary purpose. Because if you, like I can argue that the normal telecom service, the telephone and SMS, that can also become a significant social media intermediary, because it is possible for me to exchange content over SMS. It is possible to exchange some amount of material over SMS. So does that also become a significant social media intermediary? What would be the test in these cases would be the primary purpose for which the platform has been created. If it is a purely enterprise platform which is been created for a different purpose, if it is purely a communication platform, so I can contrast even our platforms. Let us
But
take.
Shekhar, to counter that, that was what existed in the leaked draft that the Internet Freedom Foundation had published, and that said, and I quote, it's the exceptions were for that it should not include an intermediary which primarily, number one, enables commercial or business-oriented transactions, or provides access to the internet or computer networks, or is in the nature of a search engine, online encyclopedia, online directory or suggestion tool, email service, or online storage service. Now, both Teams and Skype effectively are intermediaries which primarily or solely enable online interaction between two or more users and allows them to create, upload, share, disseminate, modify, or access information using that service. So
You are perfectly right. In fact, the leaked draft was much better. It gave a lot of clarity as to who is included and who is not. And one of the areas which we would be requesting the government to look into is how to carve out an exception to those entities whom they didn't want to cover. We are certainly intermediaries. So if there is any content flowing on any of the Microsoft platforms, whether it is Azure or O365 or Xbox or anything, we are definitely duty bound to remove such content, and we have a proper mechanism to do it. We have a 24/7 centers response time, very beautiful system is there. But and to classify it as a social media intermediary would probably be a wrong classification. So these are some of the gaps in the existing draft. The leaked draft was certainly much better.
So in fact, as Yajas is saying in the comments, any broad reading of the with a social media intermediary.
I lost you for a few seconds. Could you repeat? Any broad reading?
I was just saying that Yajas is saying in the comments that even a cyber cafe, going by the definition they've used, will be a social media intermediary, significant social media intermediary. Although yes, I don't know if there are 5 million cyber cafe users in the country anymore, or if there are enough cyber cafes to enable that access.
Yes. So as I told you, even a simple telecom network can be, if we stretch the definition, people sending SMSs, it becomes a social media intermediary. I'm using
I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you on the compliance related issues. I think we need to delve a little deeper into that. I'd like to bring in Rahul Narayan. Rahul Narayan is an advocate on record in the Supreme Court and has been involved in many civil rights cases, including the right to privacy case. Rahul, just looking at these rules, and thank you so much for joining us last minute. How do you think that these rules are constitutional? Rahul?
Thanks for having me, Nikhil. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, on the face of it, I mean, I think that these rules are not particularly good for privacy. They're not particularly good for security, and they're not particularly good for our rights. So they make us, in a way, less free, less secure, and they adversely impact our privacy as well. I think there are certain aspects of it which will almost certainly be read down, if not actually struck down by the courts, and several others which probably should be as well. So maybe I think in the end, what is eventually upheld in what is left after the court challenges are over would be a considerably different draft than what exists now. And I mean, I've heard the discussion so far with great interest. And I think it's actually interesting to note that so far, all the people who have challenged this in the courts all seem to be only media entities. None of the other significant social media entities have actually challenged the operation of this yet. And I should imagine that at some point, maybe teams or somebody, if they decide to go in for a challenge, they might raise more interesting issues as to how social media intermediaries have been defined and how they can be regulated better. I think this may be something which many private companies should be thinking about as well.
But I mean, are these rules constitutional? I mean, how do you think that this kind of a regime, almost like an enforcement regime, is it backed by law?
See, there are several aspects to this. I mean, one of the most important legal aspects, which might not be particularly fascinating for a technology audience, is the fact that this is what is called subordinate legislation, a rule making thing. So rules typically have to be in conformity with the Parent Act. One of the strongest grounds of challenge in the court is that these rules go well beyond what the Parent Act ever envisaged. And therefore, what needed to have been done was that if you wanted to do something like this should have been an amendment in the law rather than making under rules. And for a non-legal audience, let me explain to you like this. In our country, we are a democracy. Laws are made by Parliament or by the Legislative Assembly. They pass the laws. The Rajya Sabha gives its comments to the Lok Sabha. They pass a bill on both houses by majority. The president, or for that matter, the governor signs it, and it becomes a law, right? Rules, on the other hand, are made by the executive. They're made by the government and not by any law-making body. Therefore, when you have rules which really go well beyond the scope of the act, you are actually they are actually bypassing the role of Parliament in a way. So they're taking power away from the representatives of the people to the government. Therefore, as a general principle in administrative law and constitutional law, you cannot delegate, for example, law-making powers to the government in the form of rules. So when you create rules, under the rules you cannot create new legal obligations. For example, the entire thing should be covered by the Central Act, by the Bare Act, and you can make rules under that, but not over that, if you know what I mean.
So Rahul, the Act, from what I remember, doesn't define social media intermediaries or significant social media intermediaries. They're being defined in the rules themselves. Is that constitutional? Can the rules define a new type of entity under the Act? Because there are separate rules for cyber cafes, but from what I remember, cyber cafes are defined in the IT Act.
I think that's actually a very good question. That's something we'll have to think about. I think on the face of it, again, I mean, the analysis could change after a detailed study. But on the face of it, I think the absence of certain definitions in the Act is pretty important. You can't, like, it's difficult for you to create a new category and define that in the rules itself. It would have been far more prudent, for example, for the Act to have been amended to make certain rules. Now, for example, this entire debate about whether an entity is a social media intermediary or not. And I understand that maybe you need a government agency to actually classify that, no, we mean to regulate you, or we don't mean to regulate somebody else. But the parameters for that should have been there in the law itself. They're not there, so this is completely in the air, so to speak.
Nikhil, if I may, the way that they have brought in they've defined social media intermediaries is they've defined it as an intermediary. Intermediaries, anyways, is defined under the Act. So they are defining this under the scope of the intermediary, and that's how they are justifying that, they can regulate this. They are saying it's a type of intermediary that we are willing to, regulate. So that's how the scheme, as far as the definition is concerned. Of course, it does go beyond its
That's my question, right? Can subordinate legislation effectively create a new definition, even if it is under a main definition, right? Like,
I think this is an eminently arguable point, Nikhil. I think the government will certainly argue what Harshita has been saying, that this is a certain kind of intermediary. So that's actually a very good point. The other side could just say that, this is actually a false kind of interpretation, because what you are essentially doing is bringing in a completely different kind of obligation. But then again, I mean, if you think about it from a rational point of view, that no act can actually, and particularly in an area like information technology where things are fast changing, it would be quite difficult for an act to contain comprehensive definitions. You have to have some level of vagueness, and that level of vagueness would have to be justified in the rules. So it's a vexed point, I think. I mean, you can't say categorically that a new definition is not permitted. But I mean, one could certainly argue that this definition should not, because it creates so many new obligations, particularly for this particular kind of entity, as opposed to others. I think it's arguable that this may not be constitutional.
Urvashi, would you have a different definition for significant social media intermediaries?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to step back on the intermediary question itself. And I apologize if I betray my lack of legal knowledge and experience here. But I don't, I mean, I would rather frame some of the significant social media intermediaries. I don't see them as neutral platforms. They're not just go-betweens, right? They're not neutral kind of conduits between two users, and all they're doing is playing that intermediary role. They in fact do much more. So I would actually think of them as, I would use two frames maybe to think of them. One is to think of them as publishers, right? And the other is to think of them as curators. If you think of them as publishers, then they should have certain responsibilities that come with being a publisher, right? Like traditional media houses have, that you have certain responsibilities that come with being a publisher. Similarly, and some of those responsibilities would be things like how you do advertising, or the transparency of your editorial board, right? Those are the kind of things we expect from a publisher. Or if you think of them as a curator of information, because it's not just that everything that is being uploaded by users onto the platform is then just being mirrored and shared, right? There are algorithms that curate what you see more of, what you see less, who sees what. And so as curators, then I think they have a different set of obligations, right? And then the question becomes, how are you curating? What are the mechanisms through which you're curating? And do those mechanisms create certain silences or certain harms or certain kinds of discrimination? And then the question becomes on how do we address that curatorial power of these platforms. So, I mean, so to come back to your question about intermediaries, I think that we have to think of them as more than intermediaries. They're not just neutral platforms, right? They're doing something. So it's not just the content that is on these platforms that's an issue. I actually think the content is not the issue. The issue is what happens with the content. And that's where the agency of these platforms comes in. And that's where the power of these platforms comes in. So that's where I think we need to focus our attention, our regulatory attention, our attention as think tank.
If you think about it, it's both, because some of the content is also like the rules raise the issue of child pornography needing to be taken down. It's both the content and the virality that effectively trying to address the content and its secrecy right now by the looks of it. Or
yeah, it is.
The virality and the sharing of that content.
Sure. But I think if we think of, I mean, for the content itself, like things like child pornography, etc. I mean, we do have, you know, we have legal frameworks that help us address that. We know that, okay, this is illegal content. This is not acceptable content. I think the real issue that we're seeing is the virality issue. That to me is the crux of the conversation in the context of online harm. And that is where we should be focusing our attention. The content issue in itself, I think, becomes an issue because you have such large platforms, right? That's where scale becomes really important. And that's, I think, a separate conversation about how you address scale through competition, so on and so forth. But I feel like the focus here really should be on the virality question. And that's where the power and agency of these platforms comes in. And that's what we should be focusing our attention on.
Nikhil, may I step in for 1 minute, please?
Sure, Rahul.
Sorry, I was just wanting to add that I think it's very important to note, like I said before, that in none of the challenges to the rules so far has this issue been raised. And I should imagine that if there eventually comes an intermediary which feels it should not be so regulated, then it could perhaps bring something that, you know, maybe you should define or read down the definition contained in the rules as such. So rather than a constitutional challenge saying that per se it may be bad, it may be more prudent, or it may be more likely that a particular entity might get a judgment saying that this particular kind of entity should not be regulated as a social media intermediary. That may make a difference, I think. Also in terms of proportionality, etc., which is of course a different analysis. And it's an important legal point anyway. You know, like for example, would a regulation covering cars also include, for example, a statue of a car in a park? It's a famous legal example. I mean, it's just the kind of thing like what Mr. Chandrasekhar was saying about teens. You know, there are certain, or what Harshita was saying about certain apps in Xiaomi. It totally depends on various factors. And I should imagine that there may be some clarity on this either institutionally or because of subsequent litigation. But on the face of it, if these rules as they're being challenged now, I don't see this as a particularly strong ground for them to be struck down. There are other important and strong grounds, but not necessarily this one.
So, I mean, are there, so you think that one argument could be for the exemptions to be brought back as they were?
I think so. And maybe there should be some authority to decide this. I mean, I don't think that the government or the authority actually intends to basically make business difficult for entities which shouldn't be covered. So if there is an entity which would clarify this, like maybe in the sense like the income tax has they answer your questions, right? As a kind of, I've forgotten what the authority is called right now, but a kind of advisory sort of function to advise you whether you're covered or not. I think that might be useful for particular people to see. A CBDT thing. Yeah, thank you. Somebody's in the clarified in the comments. Yeah.
So just if anyone wants to address this,
shall
do
I?
You think that? Good.
I'll just jump in here. The first point is challenging its constitutionality. I was just reading the comments of Deepak Maheshwari. So I agree that, this space is changing so fast that it may probably not be prudent to go in for amending the law completely and going through the entire parliamentary process again. because I don't see why the ministry or the government would not have done it, because it wouldn't have been difficult for them. I mean, and it has taken enough time from 2018 to arrive here. It would probably have taken the same amount of time to have made it go through the parliamentary process. And new kinds of technologies are coming now. For example, there could be a platform which is offering IoT services. That is also an intermediary. It will have a different kind of liability. There could be a platform which is offering AI services that will have a different kind of liability. So when this was being discussed, there was also a recommendation from the industry. So we all wanted that this should be even more finely defined. So we were thinking in terms of dump pipe, dump storage, and two more categories. So if you have just dump pipe, an internet service provider or a telecom service provider would be probably in the category of dump pipe, or somebody who is carrying an optic fiber cable is intermediary, which is a dump pipe. There could be dump storage. If there is a platform as a service, it becomes a dump storage. So, or infrastructure as a service, it becomes a dump storage. Now, when it comes to software as a service, then there is some amount of curation or some amount of control over it. And then you have platforms where the users exercise a greater degree of control. There is virality. There are more possibilities of harms. So this is what we had suggested. It would have been probably better if the regulation had all these nuances and more captured. That would have caused much less confusion.
So just from and I wanted to just check with you on this. Is there just going back to regulatory capacity? Is there regulatory capacity to deal with this? You think if so many entities with more than 5 million users are potentially significant social media intermediaries? I mean, if you think about it, the Times of India group, their website allows for comments. And for the purpose of comments, they're an intermediary. And they also allow, they have a bunch of interactive features built along with that. So effectively, the Times Internet which publishes, economictimes.com and timesofindia.com is a significant social media intermediary. So just the breadth of these rules, do you think there's enough regulatory capacity to manage that large number?
Yeah, so the answer could be both yes and no. If you see our experience over the last 10 years, it has been some kind of a management by exception. So it is not that the regulator or the ministry comes in for every event or any incident. It is only when it crosses a certain threshold, it comes to the police as a case, etc., etc. So they don't need to proactively police. They need to put very good laws and then handle the exceptions well. Each exception creates a case for the intermediaries to follow, and with the existing mechanism and manpower, with a little bit of bolstering, I think we should be able to manage. Because please remember that the regulator is only creating the law. It is not creating a gateway as to who can join this club and who cannot join this club. So it is not that kind. There is no auction happening. There is no entry pass happening. It is only the regulator who is more like an umpire blowing the whistle every time something goes out of something is not being played according to the rules. For that, you don't need a huge capacity.
Now, Urvashi, do you think there's a need for a statutory body like, for regulating for harms like the UK is proposing?
Maybe a question back to you and the other panelists first is, I'm not sure, I think it would help to have some specification of the type of harms we're talking about or what harms we're talking about. I think that gets thrown around quite loosely, and it might require different types of responses for different kinds of harm. So just to make that point, I do think that there is a need for some kind of body, right? Like the UK is proposing, or that we see experiments in other geographies. Because many of these things, I don't think, for an example, it is tenable to have these conversations in silos. So I think if we're talking about platform power, we need to come at it from various different ways. If we're talking about online harms, we need to come at it from various different ways. So you need some kind of body that is able to, that is empowered and able to draw these links, right? And to draw these connections and not see it in silos. I think some of what the UK body is trying to do is in that direction. And I think that's the direction we need to move in, because otherwise we're not always matching problem and solution, right? The problems might lie somewhere else and the solutions are being proposed in a different space. Like in the context of platform power and in the context of online violence. I don't think it all falls on the platforms. I don't think it all falls on how the platforms function. We need to look beyond that.
Rahul, do you think that the cumulative regulatory burden can be handled at scale? What impact does this have on free speech?
See, I mean, that's two related questions. I'll answer them both one by one. I think that there is a certain sense of so some things may theoretically be constitutional, but they may not be particularly prudent to do. So maybe one of the things we could look at these regulations is, was it smart to make them like this and to put this kind of burden? Particularly when like Mr. Chandrasekhar was saying, it perhaps their intention is to only police the exceptions. So why make the general obligation to obey rules so difficult that nobody knows what's going to happen to them, right? I mean, the entire point of this should be a certain level of legal of certainty, that if I do this, I'm in compliance with the law. If I don't do that, I'm not in compliance with the law. So to some extent, to leave it a little vague like that is sort of unfortunate. And one of the enemies of free speech is actually vague restrictions. The fact is that, and this is, I mean, a far stronger ground for challenging these rules legally is the fact that it has a what you might call a chilling effect on free speech.
Actually what Brinda had asked, Rahul. She's asking about whether, in understanding the impact of these rules on user speech online, specifically if and how the burden of criminality may eventually fall upon the user.
I think that's absolutely true, because one of the great advantages of social media and the messaging apps has been the ability to for lack of a better word, to create virality, to reach out to a large audience. And the fact is that a certain level of anonymity has helped that as well. Now, where you have a requirement which is quite stringent, I think it is the first requirement in the world to determine the first originator first. Secondly, to store data for 180 days. And thirdly, to comply with complaints within 36 hours for the case of social media intermediaries, and that complicated structure for OTT platforms, if you don't want to get into, because that's a different discussion, like you said. The cumulative effect of all of this is when the cost of fighting for free speech is so high, then as a business decision, intermediaries would probably like to buckle under and wish to avoid every possibility of controversy. That how that would work is that when there is a doubt, the intermediary would just go immediately block, right? This is not, I mean, if you may remember this from the Shreya Singhal days as well. And I certainly remember this from the internet pornography case where I was defending the Internet Service Providers Association. The fact is that, like I said for my clients back then, ISPs don't want to get into the business of policing the internet. If the government or the courts tell us that, okay, this is bad, we'll ban it. That's part of our telecom license. We'll go ahead and we'll remove it. But don't preemptively
your actual knowledge.
Burden of actual knowledge. That's incidentally what Justice Nariman put forward in Shreya Singhal as well. So they read down the requirements of 79 and said actual knowledge. So for example, even now, if there is a court direction or if there is a direction from the government, and by all means, of course, you're supposed to remove the internet. But by putting software which is preemptively going to catch issues like nudity, by putting a 24-hour requirement to do all of that, what you're making it...
I think, Rahul, the requirement is of 15 days. 24 hours in acknowledgement, which can pretty much be automated. The adjudication has to be within 15 days.
Yeah. But the fact is, for nudity and stuff, I think there was within 36 hours it has to be removed, isn't it? Wait, maybe What I'm trying to say is that when you put a accumulation of such things, and I think that the fact that the rules say that somebody should be present in India at all times is a clear indication that, I mean, for lack of a better word, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it's almost like a hostage situation. So you ensure that the big social media intermediaries, which are foreign entities many times, and somebody would be here to ensure to take the flag of somebody. You better put this down or else, you know. So to that extent, all of this added together builds completely an atmosphere, what you might call a chilling effect, and therefore this obviously impacts the users as well. Earlier, where you could put up all kind of things, and see, and this is a very important point, and I think this is a larger thing which I think people in the technology sphere should think about. What was the actual fear of the big social media intermediaries? The actual fear was, it surely could not have been that they were ready and willing to stand up to the government, because when they stand up to our government, who are they standing in defense of? The people who they are defending are actually our people, isn't it? So the actual fact is that when there are two poles of power, the person who's actually protected is who exactly? The person who's actually protected is the actual consumer. So you could, for example, have a situation where you put up a particular tweet which the government of India wants to remove immediately, but the social media intermediary says, no, actually we are not going to remove this because because this violates free speech. So
the entire Twitter situation, right? A couple of months ago, where they declined to take down certain accounts because the orders they believed were unlawful.
Yeah.
Do you think an intermediary can take the risk of taking such a stand now after these rules?
That's exactly my point. So when you say that you have removed the power of the big social media intermediaries to flout Indian law, what you are actually saying is that the people who they were protecting earlier, Indian citizens, will now have lesser protections against the government. So instead of power being divided into two places, the power is now accumulated actually into the one space. So this is also something to think about. One way to look at it, of course, is that yes, now social media intermediary will be brought to heel and they'll be under the control of the government of India. But the second aspect of the same thing is that the freedom which you earlier had as an individual or as a person is significantly lesser now as a consequence of these.
Well, I guess it's a you either have a powerful social media intermediary regulating your content, or you have a government that's doing it now. So for the user, there's really no ideal choice here, right?
No, there isn't an ideal choice. But for example, I think I mean, again, maybe this is my own bias as a capitalist person, that and this is something which is sort of cool, which I noticed even when I was defending the internet service providers. It so happens that for certain businesses, free speech is actually a good thing, right? So it is in your best interest as a business to ensure the widest principles of freedom in the speech which you put up. Right. So therefore, since the business commercial interest, it therefore also benefits the consumer as well. Now, it may be in the best interest of the business to ensure that controversial speech is squashed. So to that effect, there is a change in incentive.
Understood. Harshita, who would want to be a chief compliance officer? Is the criminal liability for a chief compliance officer tenable here?
Firstly, not me. Secondly, I think that's a little harsh. I mean, now you're creating a profile of an officer who basically takes all liability, because firstly the rules, the entire grievance redressal that Rahul was just explaining, and you were also pitching in, that entire mechanism itself is problematic, because look at what we are trying to do here, right? A user puts up a content, and that content, somebody says take it down on grounds such as decency and morality, and I have 36 hours to take it down, right? And again, it comes upon the social media intermediary or an intermediary, as per this rule, to acknowledge and say to dispose of such complaint. So while disposing such complaint, what am I doing? So I'm actually in charge of seeing whether I should protect that person's freedom of speech or not. right? Now, whether I choose to do so or not. So that's a hell lot of power for the social media intermediary or any intermediary to sit in judgment to basically see whether, this has to be removed or not. Unless, of course, there's a court order and stuff like that. That's a different issue. If there's a court order, then I have to remove it within 36 hours. But if somebody actually, under the grievance redressal mechanism, raises this issue and brings it to my attention, then I firstly sit in judgment of whether it is correct, not correct, etc., etc. So what is the and then what is the recourse that that person has who disagrees with my adjudication? That's something that nobody knows. And I mean, even if that person disagrees with me, does that person have the right to go before a court? Does he have resources, etc., to go fight? There goes freedom of speech right out of the window, right? Now, when you're talking about all of these scenarios, and then you bring in a chief compliance officer, who, even if this person were to sit, etc., and if the government were to take a hard stand, like how it took as far as Twitter was concerned, on the farmers' protest, it asked certain accounts to be blocked, and Twitter did have the audacity to say, no, we are not blocking it, etc. We are doing this. But if right now these rules actually give enough impetus for the government to take action, and in cases where we are talking about something to do with national sovereignty, like Flags Act, or if we are talking about criminal defamation, or we are talking about anything which is which may under the Unlawful Prevention Act, etc., if those things actually, which are pretty draconian, if those statutes are involved, this chief compliance officer is directly going to the jail. So, this is basically a very, very vulnerable position that they have created for corporates to sort of, I mean, the entire thing has made this thing very vulnerable as far as the chief compliance officer is concerned. And this is a very scary, I don't even know how to tell my HR to actually source a person for such a role, because in effect, this person is taking such a huge risk sitting as a chief compliance officer, because he's going to be responsible for pretty much everything under these vague rules.
So one of the things I wanted to understand was the timelines, right? The 15-day timeline for disposal of a complaint from a user. How do you think that will work? This is for both you and Shekhar.
15 days. Again, the problem with this entire timeline, especially in 3, I'll just come to the 72 hours in a bit, but the 24 hours and 24 hours acknowledgement is still dealable, like you said, and 36 also is dealable, because you just have to block the content under, if you get a court order or the government order, you block the content, and of course, then you resort to the grievance redressal mechanism. 15 days, they don't take into account. I mean, the assumption is that you have all the infrastructure present in front of you to adjudicate the matter within 15 days. They don't take into account that a lot of these matters, especially when there are high stake matters involved, there are decision-making powers which are outside India. And 15 days actually, is a very, very short period of time to be able to adjudicate it in a manner, like they say, dispose of the complaint, which means there will be multiple iterations, reiterations, etc. So they don't take into account that at all. So the ideal way they should.
I mean, I'm just thinking of, let's take, for example, YouTube.
Exactly.
YouTube or even Facebook might be getting thousands of comments or even millions of complaints a day. With the scale of the user base that they have.
Yeah. So with that scale, 15 days becomes extremely, like I will need to have an army to be able to, deal with this kind of content, because anybody and everybody can raise an issue. And some of it might be outright silly, which still takes, you're still obliged to sort of dispose it off within a certain timeline. So therefore, these timelines are very difficult. Very, very, I think what they should have ideally done is they should have done 15 days or as as much as time it does take, of course, you need to put you need to be able to explain why it took time, and if it's unreasonably delayed, etc. You make them accountable like this, but don't put a definite number like 15 or 20, etc., which becomes really difficult, especially when you're dealing with scale. That's one. Second thing is the 72 hours that is provided to provide all the information which the law enforcement agencies ask. Now, Xiaomi has been at the receiving end as far as law enforcement agencies is concerned, because we are consumer interfacing product and organization, and therefore I understand the difficulties that this 72 hours when the law enforcement agency is behind you without actually having a definite scope of the information that they want is extremely extreme. It becomes really, really hard. And this is one challenge that we certainly as an organization will face a lot, because, you're talking about basically 3 days. And when you're talking, sometimes these law enforcement agencies make a request for information that I might not have directly. I might have to procure it as an OS or as an intermediary to an intermediary. Then 3 days really becomes very difficult. And if I don't, provide this information, then obviously I have consequences under this rule in the Act. So I don't think the rules do justice at all as far as the timelines are concerned.
Shekhar?
Yeah, so I'm coming in with almost a decade of experience in dealing with these issues. So in my own experience, the free speech angle is, it comes very few and far in between. Of course, we are not any significant social media intermediate. There are various kinds of requests which come. So there are some requests which want a takedown, somebody's nude picture or something, non-consensual pornography and stuff like that. There could be some cases where there is an infringement of IPR. There could be some cases where there is incendiary material. There could be some cases where there is a possibility of wounding somebody's feelings. And of course, then you have the Flag Act and relations between nation states, etc., etc. So in my experience, especially for, restricted to platforms like what we deal with, the judgment of what needs to be removed is not very difficult. At best, there could be cases where there is an IPR or alleged IPR infringement where I don't know whether it is actually an infringement or not. I just give a notice to the person and say that, boss, I have got this complaint, and I keep it aside. I can't hear you, Nikhil.
I'm saying, let's take an issue like defamation, for example, but there might be defamatory content.
Yes, there could be defamatory content. Yes, defamatory content. So that's what I'm saying, that I'm prefacing by saying that I have not faced too many of issues like this. Once or twice when we have pushed back to the agencies concerned about some cartoons, etc. So we requested the agency to see if that cartoon came in the newspaper the next day, would it cause offense? It was a very simple way to explain to the authority who is at a lower level. They said no. Then I said, then why are you trying to block it if it is on the internet? What is the difference? And then they sort of backed off. Some cases we had where it was problematic, where it concerned IPR or a trademark, somebody using somebody's trademark, where we had to inform the parties concerned and say that please get an order or whatever for it to get instituted back, or whatever the content. As far as our platforms are concerned, we had very few cases where we needed to take a judgment call like this. Of course, in the case of significant social media, where there is a lot of exchange of opinions, individual opinions, groups, etc., they are in a tougher spot. I fully concede that. But we have not faced too many problems of this kind of a Hobson's choice to remove, not remove, and stuff like that.
Okay. Thanks. So we're sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to run through a few questions that I noted down. Um, any views on automated takedowns and how they might have an impact on speech? Uh, Harshita, Rahul.
I could because we are
Sure.
doing this, so I can just quickly cover this automated takedown.
Hmm.
So see, world over there is a issue of free speech, there is a issue of freedom of expression, etc., etc. But world over there is consensus on on at least one thing, which is child pornography, which it is wrong.
And the other is terrorist content now.
Terrorism, okay, that you can say one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter and stuff like that. So there again, there is no absolute judgment.
Hmm.
So there are technologies like photo DNA, which Microsoft has developed and given free of cost to the global community, which helps to reduce the virality and identify if any image has become viral, so that it helps in the takedown of such images. And this is done in a very automated fashion. After it is done, there is a manual adjudication whether it has been it's catching properly or not, and then the algorithm teaches itself to become better. But that is a very narrow scope, and it is working very well. Otherwise, your entire internet will become completely toxic with really horrible kind of material going around. But this does not mean peering into the conversations of people or peering into any of these things. So it is confined only to this. There is an international treaty and it is working very well. That's it.
Rahul, do you think that the recommendation for automated takedowns and the other way of looking at this is that it seems to be on a best efforts basis. So is this in line with Puttaswamy?
I don't think it's in line with Puttaswamy, but let me answer your first question to Mr. Chandrasekhar as well. I have three quick points. Firstly, I think if you recall, the main purpose of what is an intermediary is somebody who doesn't actually create or police content. So to some extent, when you're asking them to preemptively to police the content, they're kind of aren't they sort of in violation of the essential principles of what constitutes an intermediary? That's the first point about it. Second point is the way the system normally work or should work is that if somebody has a complaint about a particular thing, you make a complaint and you take that down immediately, right? When you have an automated system, the problem with automated system, I mean, it may be a brilliant automated system, but you need some manual intervention at the end. In fact, the entire, I mean, to ensure that the mechanism works properly, I don't think it is fair or correct to have anybody deprived of anything on the basis purely of an automated thing. The problem with this, Nikhil, are you still there?
I'm here, Rahul. I'm here.
Sorry. The problem with automated things, for example, many times is that if you're depriving somebody, for example, of a scholarship or depriving somebody of rations on the basis of an automated system, you don't know whether it actually works or not. I don't see why it's particularly different for this as well. So you would need some kind of manual intervention. And then again, I mean, this is why not just work on when there is a complaint, you take it down immediately. I don't see the need to put it as a preemptive requirement. I think it's very intrusive. And again, in the Puttaswamy network, it may actually violate privacy as well.
Quick comments. So first is this automated and best effort basis. This is a fallout of the Prajwala case, where the Supreme Court constituted an expert committee. I was also a member of that, where we examined various technologies and where it was said that there cannot be 100% effective way. It has to be on a best effort basis. And secondly, there are many types of content which are going in the deep web, which is not so easily visible. So there will not be people who will be complaining, or there will not be people who know enough. And there are very deep syndicates who do this kind of work. And that is why the whole world has come together as a community under NCMEC USA to remove this kind of a child pornography content. And the third thing is manual adjudication is very difficult, because to give you an example, YouTube creates 300 minutes of video every second or some crazy number like that. So manual adjudication is completely off the discussion. It has to be automated. We have to ensure that while it is automated, it doesn't violate free speech and other things. Otherwise, there's really, really horrible content which the world is groping with. That's it.
Okay, as a very quick rejoinder, I bow to your expertise as a member of Prajwala, but I mean, it was certainly argued, for example, Live Law is arguing that Prajwala didn't actually mean this. I mean, of course, since you were part of the committee, you probably know more about this than this. And secondly, that's like, if nobody knows about it, it's like a tree falling in the forest. Did it happen? So, I mean, I agree that child, there is a certain harm itself in child porn, and I'm not the last person to defend it. But again, I mean, this is a matter of proportionality. It's also a matter of some sensitivity. What would be the impact generally on algorithms and the operation of intermediaries if they're supposed to put stuff like that? Again, you may have a particularly great software for this.
No, but one more thing. Even dumb intermediaries, they are supposed to police the safety of their platform. So, for example, on cybersecurity, the creation of botnets and all that. So, even if it is a dumb intermediary, they have to keep policing it. So in an ideal world, it would be purely dumb and they'll lock the room and not know what's going on inside. But in the real world, they see the traffic, they see how much is getting viral, they see if there are any botnets created, any cybersecurity, DDoS attacks and all that to keep the platform safe. So this is just one more kind of safety from the content perspective. Not an ideal world, but this is the real world, what I'm saying.
Aditya?
Yeah, thanks. So Urvashi, like circling back to you, what is your take on the whole automated takedown discussion right now? I mean, it seems to obviously increase platform power and curatorial tendencies. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would almost entirely echo what Rahul is saying. I don't think we should have a completely automated system, no matter how much universal consensus there is on certain things. That consensus is anyway, it's always assumed, right? So I do think we need to have some human intermediation in that. It shouldn't be entirely an automated process, because then you're in some sense reliant on a black box algorithm. You don't know how it's working, what's happening there, none of that, right? So I do think you need to have a human in the loop, as has become now a common phrase. But I do think that ultimately the issue that we're not addressing here is, again, I'm sorry to keep coming back to it, is like, why is it so hard? Like Chandrasekhar, you were saying, why is it so hard to actually do this manually? The reason it's so hard is because there's so much content, and that's because there's the scale of these platforms, right? So we can keep plugging the leaks in a dam and saying, okay, we'll automate this and we'll automate that, but ultimately, until you deal with the scale issue, it's very hard to structurally shift this conversation.
I mean, does scale seem to be more of a global issue? I mean, at this point, what can India right now do? What can the Indian government do?
I mean, what realistically India can do, I don't know. I'd leave that to the lawyers on this call, right? I think you guys will have a much better sense on what is possible in terms of a jurisdiction sense, right? But I mean, thinking about things like competition policy, thinking about things like interoperability, I think we have to kind of have this whole suite of solutions, and only then we'll be able to address one of these issues. If we just kind of go for very narrow questions like, should we automate the uploading of child pornography, that's a very narrow frame through which to consider the role of platforms and platform power. So you need these multiple kind of prongs, multiple kind of approaches together if we want to structurally address this issue. Otherwise, we're just plugging harms as we see them.
Thanks, Urvash. So we have a question from an attendee. I mean, this is for the entire panel here. How do the rules basically affect federated internet? I mean, let's take Mastodon for an example. I mean, it's not run by a company per se, but run by individuals, and there are federated instances. So in a situation with the rules in place right now, what happens to them? Do they not function at all? Anybody? Rahul, would you like to take a stab at that?
It's actually a very good question. I haven't thought about it, and I don't know much about the structure of Mastodon. But my first reaction is that it may just be ecosystem. I don't know if this is what will eventually happen, and if we look at their structure, maybe we can find out an answer for them. But on the face of it, I don't see how they could compare.
Okay. Rahul, another question perhaps you could weigh in on. How do you see these rules vis-a-vis Shreya Singhal judgment?
Actually, it is answered that on the group. I mean, like I said, this
Oh, okay.
is the fundamental point of challenge. But everybody who's challenged it so far is saying that it violates Shreya Singhal. So the courts are eventually going to decide on that. I think on the face of it, also there seems to be certain violations in any case.
Mr. Chandrasekhar, we had planned to ask you, we had briefly touched upon this, but Microsoft Teams recently announced that they're going to roll out end-to-end encryption, and this happened actually on a global level, but this happened after the rules came out. In this sort of a situation, what happens to such a plan? How does it impact the rollout of end-to-end encryption in India for Microsoft Teams?
We haven't yet examined this issue in detail, but we have a policy of horses for courses. So we have different products, different flavors. For example, the Teams, which is rolled out in India, it has the feature of making Teams to mobile calling or landline calling blocked because of the India's telecom regulation. So if there is some regulation like that, then we will have the product which is tailor-made for India.
Okay.
Because again, we are an enterprise. So if there is a regulation for an enterprise, there should not be a problem. So at the enterprise level, end-to-end encryption is probably encouraged because for banking and so many secure transactions, people will pay us for the end-to-end encryption.
We have another question from an attendee. Perhaps, Mr. Chandrasekhar, you could answer again, since you work with Microsoft and perhaps one of the largest companies in the world. So, I mean, Nikhil Mahadeva asked that what happens when these rules apply to an entity or a service at a service level? For example, Google owns YouTube. The number of users of Google may far exceed that of YouTube. How would that work in your particular case?
Yes. So
how would that work?
Yeah, so we are, so the point is that we consider each individual service as an intermediary. So every service has a particular purpose. So I will not speak for Google and its services. I can speak of Microsoft and its services. So let us say Teams, it has a particular purpose. Hotmail has a particular purpose. Outlook has a particular purpose. Bing has a particular purpose. Each one of these services are intermediaries. Each one of these services have different level of compliance. Each one of these services have different level of obligations, irrespective of one service might be really huge and very popular. One service may be less popular, but we are ready to, or rather we are working to find a way to comply to the obligations of each individual service.
We have a very interesting question from Janil Shah. I mean, apart from what we have spoken of so far, what are the pros? I mean, do you see any positives in the rules? And this is, again, a question for the entire panel. Do you see any pros in the new rules, keeping aside what's ambiguous, of course? Anybody? Rahul, perhaps? Rahul, Mr. Chandrasekhar.
I can go first.
Sure, please do.
See, we are like children in a classroom, so we won't like what the class teacher says. So because it's definitely going to create compliance burdens, it is definitely going to create engineering effort. It is definitely going to create a different way of doing business, etc. So those are all the negatives or so-called negatives. But what also needs to be kept in mind is that technology bounds far ahead of law. And this is one way by which law is trying to catch up with technology, maybe unsuccessfully, maybe not in a perfect manner, but it's definitely new types of technologies have come. So the law is trying to keep pace with that. So the effort to bridge the gap between technology and the law is definitely the positive side, though I fully concede that it is nowhere close to being perfect. or nowhere close to being really effective.
Anyone else who would like to weigh in on this question?
I think it has some good provisions also in relation to privacy policies, that is, which operate between platforms and their users, and the fact that reporting of cyber security incidents, all of that stuff is the standard requirements which ought to be there, and all the rules are there as well. So to that extent, all of that is absolutely fine. But the important thing to consider is that for at least again from both from practitioners like Mr. Chandrasekhar said, and for lawyers like us, we look at rules from a different perspective. They are already in force. So we look at what's bad with them and what can be changed. So maybe we don't focus so much on the positive of it, not because we are essentially negative people, but maybe because the nature of our work is sort of to find the problem.
Sure. So we also, and this is something I think we completely missed, but also significant social media intermediaries have been given the option of voluntarily verifying users. I mean, Rahul, since you work in cases such as these, what do you think this implies? Is this sort of the first step towards an Aadhaarified social media ecosystem? Is that what we should be expecting?
I'm afraid so. I hope this is not the case. And frankly, I thought people had generally decided that the government had actually decided this a couple of years back, that they're now going to make Aadhaar mandatory for social media accounts. But it seems to be the first step to in that sort of direction. I don't see the utility as to the utility as to why it's done, and I don't see any great advantages to it. I do think yes, eventually this will be a way by the back door to eventually make it so ubiquitous that it becomes mandatory. So in the end, they will achieve through an indirect route what for example they would never be able to achieve directly. The court, for example, would always held that this is completely disproportionate. You see, the point is, why did the court strike down the linking of Aadhaar with your phone number? That is completely disproportionate. Maybe 5 people are criminals, but that doesn't mean it's punished 95 million, right? Similarly, I mean, for social media accounts, one has to see this, and this is an important perspective for the entire thing. One should assume that everybody who's posting stuff is posting bad things, and one shouldn't assume that everything is against national security, etc., etc. Most things are actually fairly harmless. So to put a burden on everybody to prevent even that small thing, it could be disproportionate. Like we say, you don't use a nuclear weapon where you could get by using a pistol.
But as disconcerting as it may be, do you think currently in the how vague it is formulated right now, do you think it can be challenged, and realistically can it amount to anything?
I think at this point we are all warning about it, but I would imagine that when the requirement becomes more vigorous, when the things change over time, then maybe over time it may prove to be one of the more dangerous provisions of this bill, of these rules. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Rahul. Harshita, Urvashi, any parting thoughts? We're almost out of time. Any parting thoughts? Anything that you would like to add?
Actually, I wanted to ask Harshita about what she thinks of the users having to be informed about various policies on a frequent basis. I mean, how do you think users are going to react to that? How, as a platform, will you do that?
I think that is to sort of put very curtly, it'll be like we'll be spamming their inboxes with information that they may not even read, unless we make it in such a form that it's very easy to read and it's in a crisp manner. But the rules seem to suggest that not only I'll have to spam sort of send all of these details every time, periodically on I think it says once a year. It also keeps saying that I need to keep reminding the users every once a year that if you don't comply with these privacy policy rules and regulations or terms of use, you will lose access to this platform. I mean that's a very I would say it's a pretty obvious thing, and that's something that is already there in the privacy policy. You don't really have to
wait. Isn't WhatsApp doing the same thing with its privacy policy?
Banks are also, credit card companies also, most important terms and conditions that comes once a year.
So, no, I know, but the thing is, just think about a platform like we have something called as Themes, right? And Themes also has privacy policy, etc., etc. And when you treat these individual apps, which really does not matter to a user's life, not talking about financial information and stuff like that, you keep sending these messages, and because it's an obligation, then it sort of, I think it's going to add to that fatigue. People are still going to get dissuaded in reading any of these things, when people might just quickly delete, even if I have most important information to communicate to the users, because this has become mandatory. So I think that was totally unnecessary. Of course, whenever there was any change in the privacy policy, informing that to the users really makes sense. But this annually telling them, if you don't comply, I'm going to remove the data, it was quite unnecessary.
So what about transparency reports?
So as far as the social media, significant social media intermediaries are concerned, I think that is going to be quite a burdensome affair, because one, we're talking about the scale, and two is basically getting this. So you really have to create a team to actually sit and compile the data. So we have started this transparency report compliance program for Xiaomi, and from my experience, it's not been a very easy exercise at all. And this is where I'm not even a social media intermediaries at the scale of Facebook, Twitter, etc., etc. So it is quite.
Hasida, this is also a transparency report in terms of grievance redressal, right? About user complaints and how you dealt with them. Yeah. This is not necessarily what we're seeing with transparency reports otherwise about government requests. Absolutely. Or you think this is all of it?
I think it's all of it, because the way it is worded is that you need to talk about, the complaints that you've received and the takedowns that you may have got from the government, etc. So it's a huge report, which means, I'll have to allot additional resources to actually sit and do this. And it does not really talk about, it just talks about this rule 3.7. 3.2 in all its form, which means that any grievance that I've got, I need to report, even if it's like the silliest grievance, I need to start compiling in a certain way and file it with the government. I think that's a huge compliance burden.
So we'd also invited Apramaya from KU for this discussion, and I think their new platform, they have a lot of government actors and political actors on the platform already. We were actually quite curious about how, as a young entity, or the first time, they're just, I think, a year or so old, how they would implement all of these compliances, especially since, when I logged into the platform, they didn't have most of these things. So it's going to be a particularly costly affair for them, I guess, also, and a tedious affair for them. I have one last question for Shekhar, because we have the privilege of having him here, and this pertains to the next session. But Shekhar, which is on traceability and encryption. But Shekhar, Microsoft came out and said that they're implementing end-to-end encryption, and that's one of the major platforms or major services actually giving its backing to the technology. How do these rules impact the plans for Microsoft and E2E globally and in India?
So it's good business for us, because cyber security is one of the biggest worries around the world. And we are primarily an enterprise company. There are so many domains like banking, etc., where security, the more it is strengthened, the better it is. And so there was a need from our customers that strengthen security even further. So the issues which affect the social media intermediaries, they are not attracted to the platforms which are being used essentially by corporates. So, like, for example, RBI or other regulators, they say that you strengthen encryption. The stronger it is, the better it is for the customer, for the transactions to go through, etc. So we look at it from that perspective, not from the perspective of the social media intermediaries.
But the rules don't necessarily distinguish between business use cases and non-business use cases when it comes to an interaction.
Yes, so that is one area which we are taking up with the government to seek more clarity. But this is where we are. So for us, it is a differentiator, good, better security.
Okay. Great. Thank you all for a great session. I know we couldn't take all the questions that we had, but I hope there's more food for thought and more clarity on what these rules mean for the internet as a whole. I think there are going to be more discussions and more debates. In fact, there's one taking place right now, and we had a bit of a scheduling snafu with the dialogue, and they have a discussion going on right now as well. But I hope there will be more conversations, and more than that, I hope the government actually engages with us on, and with us as in internet users, and there's a more of a public consultation process if these rules are to be evolved further, and maybe some of the issues that we've raised addressed. So our next session is on traceability, which is a critical part of the history of the development of the IT rules. We've got we've seen the evolution of these rules from, for example, we've covered Anthony Rubin's case on WhatsApp and traceability in the Madras High Court. We've seen that case transferred to the Supreme Court. We've had discussions over the years on this issue. And now here we are with the need for an originator to be determined by a platform. We've got a great set of speakers for this, 2 technologists and a lawyer. I'd like to invite them to basically just start their videos. And I'll start with you, Debayan. You're a computer scientist from MIT. You teach cryptography. I'm just curious, in terms of how does this demand for the originator of a message work from a technology perspective when it comes to end-to-end encryption? The expectation from the government is that significant social media intermediaries will enable the originator of a message. Is this feasible in an end-to-end encrypted environment, or for an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform?
Okay, so in an end-to-end encrypted environment, yes. In a messaging platform, no. Because look, if your definition of end-to-end is I am sending a message to you, sort of like TLS security on the internet or whatever. If everyone knows that I'm sending a message to you and there are intermediaries in that message, then sure, maybe you can have originator information. But when we're talking about a messaging platform, right? When people are sending messages to each other, here are 2 very good thumb rules to check against whatever policy anyone is putting forth. Thumb rule number 1, ciphertext indistinguishability, which means if I send ABCD to you versus I send EFGH to you, nobody else in the world should be able to tell which one went out. Nobody. The second one, take that same idea, put it in a forwarding context. Suppose my mom sends me ABCD and my dad sends me AFGH. I forward one of those 2 messages to you. Nobody in the world, except I guess you and me, should be able to know which of those 2 messages I sent forth. If you can, then something's broken somewhere in the system, right? Okay. Now, within the text itself, you can have all sorts of things, but I'm saying outside of the text, you can't have any of this. You can have all of this without security guarantees. I can write my mom's name on the message she forwarded and I can send it to you. But that's just me writing stuff. There are no security guarantees involved. The moment you start putting in these security guarantees on originator information, whatever that means, and I hope we'll make it clear over the course of this conversation, it's not currently feasible.
Well, what does originator information mean?
I don't know. I doubt anyone else does either. Like, what do you mean the first originator in the territory of India, first of all? Like, what's up? Is that the +91 number? How does, let's say, WhatsApp know that someone's in the territory of India? What if it's someone like me who had a +91 number and then, let's say, somebody else decided to move to Germany and then just kept that number? I don't see a German constitutional court being very happy with WhatsApp if they allowed that. the first originator is, am I only talking about a forwarding chain, or are you also talking about copy paste? Right? Like a lot of this stuff, what if I forward the same picture but with a different caption? What if I add text to a piece of text that I received and forwarded? Are they talking about sort of only pristine data that's forwarded? Like, a lot of these conversations need to happen before such rules are put into action. That's all I say.
So you said there are three things, right? One, you said cyber text indistinguishability. Which were the other two?
So one is the ciphertext indistinguishability.
Yes.
The other two have to do with the metadata involved, right? I can have everything being indistinguishable. The other two, I don't want to get into technical terms. One is semantic security. Even if I send the same message twice to an outsider, those two things should look different. Right? So if I send you hello once, I send you hello again, these two look like completely different things. Right? And the third is really a feasibility condition. Because if you, right now, everything's sort of happening between you and me. The moment we need to say that every time I send you a message, then let's say Facebook or WhatsApp needs to keep like a hashed copy of it or some such stuff, their servers are going to die in like an hour. Can you imagine? Like, think about the number of stupid good morning messages you receive, right? Like, this is not feasible at all. I mean, the way I see it, if anyone implements something like this, any criminals know that, let's say, ABC messaging platform, WhatsApp is doing blah, blah, blah stuff with the government, they'll just use something else. Like, why would the criminals stay on a platform that they know are compromised? Why would anyone stay on a platform that if they know that it's compromised?
So, you know, I was just, I was wondering about whether it's possible for a platform like Signal or WhatsApp to be re-architected to meet these requirements. And is it reasonable? Like, what's a reasonable time frame for that to happen?
Okay, so I'll tell you what my issue with the current set of requirements is. And I think we had a conversation like this before where I used the same metaphor. The government is asking, think about airplanes. The government is asking to have roll down windows on airplanes, right? And all the aeronautical engineers are you mad? You can't have roll down windows on airplanes. People will die. This doesn't work. This is against everything we've ever learned. Until the government tells us, hold on, there's this thing called COVID, and we need some way to get fresh air on airplanes. Now the aeronautical engineers say, oh, okay, now that makes sense. Your reasoning is valid. You have a real reason why you're asking us for this. We can put in these special filters we've created for this occasion. The problem is the government is telling us all this stuff about originator information, hashing, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of stuff. And we can't expect the government to have expertise on everything. The problem is they're giving us implementations or solutions, right? What they need to do is they need to show us the data. They need to tell us, here are the problems. Here's 1,500 cases on which we've been stuck. How can you help? When we have a very solid problem description, the exact understanding of those requirements, this is true for any software project, right? You tell me to build a version of Microsoft Word, I'll sit with you for 2 months and fight out the requirements. Once I figure out the detailed requirements, then and only then we can talk about cost. But by default, we're talking huge. This kind of change is $1 billion change. Make no mistake. This is not something that a couple of people can work out in a single paper. Because even if I do, like, let's say you're in the US, I'm in India. We're now using 2 different protocols. What we've done is virtual partition, effectively. Like, imagine if India and Bangladesh had the same fiscal rules and now we separate out those rules. And now you have problems transferring money. The same situation, right? India and US have the same technical rules and now you're moving apart. And now who sits in between and translates all of those communications? How is that going to happen? It's just completely unclear to me.
So I'm assuming that you disagree with the 3-month time frame then.
I'm saying it's like that Wolfgang Pauli, I think, thing. The physics student brings him a proof and he says, ask if the proof is right. And he says, right, this proof isn't even wrong. I'm saying it's entirely possible this can be done in 3 months. It's entirely possible this can't be done in 3 years, or that it can't be done at all. The language involved is vague enough and there are not enough data backing it up that we can't even tell. But offhand, I agree with you, yes. No way, 3 months.
Okay. Yash Kadakia is the founder of Security Brigade. Yash, are there ways to identify the originator or the identity of an originator to be determined without breaking into an encryption? Are there any mechanisms that exist on a messaging platform?
Yash, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So I would say fundamentally, no, it's not really possible, right? In very limited scenarios, it may be possible. So say, for example, in the scenario of an image upload or a video upload sort of scenario, right? Where you can track the originator, the actual upload request versus the actual, and not the communication, right? But fundamentally across the board, no. So the ask the government has made right now can't really be done without breaking into encryption, right? But every message, every communication has to be traceable across the entire life cycle of those communications. What can potentially, of course, from my perspective, right, can see potentially possible already is something of an image or something of a video content when uploaded can probably be originator tracked. The upload request itself, but not who was it sent to, when was it sent, and what happens to it post that, right? Because that would all be encrypted and would not be trackable anymore. Yeah.
Sorry, but are there ways like, can metadata be collected within an E2E environment? Are there any ways of identifying the originator?
Yeah, so like I said, so for an image or a video content format, it would be possible. I'm reasonably sure that can be done. Because if you look at any image, right, if you take an image and I send it to you, you send it to 400 different people and it goes on from there, right? If you go into a WhatsApp web or something of that, so the URL for the image is exactly the same, right? It's a cached image that they're just sending forward. So fundamentally, WhatsApp would be able to say, the first person to upload this image was X. And that I can see reasonably possible without breaking into an encryption. The challenge is a little bit different, right? The challenge is, did that image come to this person on Facebook and did they then send it on WhatsApp? Were there somebody who was technically challenged and therefore received a WhatsApp forward, went into their Photos app and then did share and fundamentally started a new message chain, right? So you would get the first person to forward that individual image, but it wouldn't necessarily be the actual originator of the image, which would, of course, technically not really be, they wouldn't be able to tell you if somebody else is. So what would happen is the government would go to WhatsApp and say, hey, we need this image that somebody has sent out. And WhatsApp could fundamentally look up who uploaded that image and tell them that information. And they would go to that person. And that person would say, oh, but I received it on X group and I downloaded it and maybe forwarded it then. And then they would have to go through that whole process again. And then maybe it goes to Facebook, and then maybe it goes to Signal and so on and so forth. So you wouldn't actually get the legally responsible originator is the way I'll put it.
And nobody knows whether the definition of originator means it's a legally responsible originator or not. How would you know whether the message hasn't been edited in the middle of this entire process?
So you mean the forwarded message, or?
No, as in just in the process of transferring, process of message being sent from one person to the other.
Yeah.
Can it be edited in the middle? Can someone intercept, rewrite, and send?
No, not. I mean, end-to-end encryption would fundamentally make that impossible, right? Because only the person sending it and the person receiving it would have access to the message. Besides for, of course, downloading it, editing it, and forwarding it again. But in that case, you would become the originator in this context. Yeah, but nobody would be able to really intercept unless they, of course, break end-to-end encryption, in which case, then yes.
Okay, just staying on the technical part of it, Debayant, there is conversation about hashing and I think the hash of the originator of the message being included in order to identify who has sent a message. They believe that there's a sense that it's technically possible. Is that a solution for traceability?
So first thing you got to imagine is that the person and any bad actor isn't using the official WhatsApp application. Okay, just imagine they're using they're using their own custom-made WhatsApp where they can say what they want, right? They just need to adhere to WhatsApp's protocols and pretend to be official WhatsApp or any other social media intermediary, I guess, whatever. In that case, let's say I'm sending a message to Yash. Nice to meet you, Yash. And I'm supposed to be attaching something at the bottom of that message that looks like garbage to Yash, but somehow encapsulates my ID, right? In some fashion or the other. What's preventing me from lying? I can put Nikhil's number in there, for example. And what's preventing Yash from changing that to something else when he forwards it the next time? Right? How do you make sure that nobody lies during the process? Like, if you're saying we're attaching a hash, and if you want me to explain what that is, I'm happy.
What is a hash?
Okay, I'll do my usual explanation of hashing. There used to be these things called checksums once upon a time. The best way to think about it is, suppose you have a page full of information, you've written down your budget for MediaNama, let's say, right? And every time you leave home, you have an evil sibling who comes and changes it. And you want to be careful of that. So what do? You add up all the digits on that page, write it on your hand when you leave. But your brother figures out that he can add +5 here and do -5 there, and you can't figure out the difference. So the next day you decide, okay, I'll add all of the numbers and then I'll multiply every alternate digit and then I'll add the sum of the two on my hand. And now it turns into this cat and mouse game where eventually you come up with some sort of horrific technique. You take every 17th row and 4th column and you do this and you do that. And basically you come up with a system where you can write down a number on your hand, which involves basically simple computations on your part, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. But for your brother to figure out some kind of edit on that page without disturbing your number so that when you come back, you can see that it comes to the same number, that would require some sort of horrific amount of computation. Does that make sense? So this hash, this thing, this number on your hand, that's a hash. It's a number that tells you that that page that you looked at has not changed since the last time you saw it.
So it can't be used to identify an originator, right? It can only let you know whether
who does the hash. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my name and I'm turning it into XLPTZ, the output of my function, and I'm sending it to you, right? Now, either you can verify that, you take my name and you hash it yourself and you check, or you can't. Like Kamakoti's second proposal, you can't. But let's say you can verify that, you can read it and you can write it. What prevents you from then lying about it on a particular forward? So either you can see inside it and edit it and so on, in which case you can lie about it, or you can't, in which case I can lie about it. I mean, somebody has to do it. At a philosophical level, somebody needs to have right access and the ability to verify that thing. If you have it, you can lie. If I have it, I can lie.
I still don't understand how a hash can be used to identify.
It can't, not verifiably. So you can say that suppose I take my phone number and I turn it into a hash, XLPTZ, and I send it to you. So you're getting a message from 99999 saying, I don't know, paint Parliament bright blue tomorrow. Suspicious sounding message. And underneath it, you have the hash of my number, XLPTZ, attached. So now what you can do is you can check, do you get XLPTZ if you hash 999999999 using some public algorithm? If so, then that's okay. But then what prevents you from replacing XLPTZ with some random garbage?
Exactly. I mean, you can't do a reverse, right? You can't figure out what the original.
But here's what you can do. You can take Narendra Modi's phone number, should you know it, attach that number on top of the message, call him the originator, and attach Narendra Modi's hash at the bottom of it, because you can compute it too. And that's that. So look, either when I send you a message, either that hash is computable and verifiable by you, In which case you can replace my number and my hash with Narendra Modi's number and Narendra Modi's hash. Or it isn't, in which case I could have given you garbage and you wouldn't know.
Understood. So I think I've understood. And honestly, I don't think how this is even possible without having to re-architect the entire platform. And but it is that is one of the other questions, right? We've got Priyadarshini Banerjee, who's a practicing advocate in the Supreme Court of India. He's represented multiple large IT companies in the Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court on this very issue of intermediate liability and other issues. Priya, let's address the law versus technology question first, right? If it is necessary for law enforcement to get access to the originator of a message, should law be able to override the technological choice of a platform of avoiding identification? Like, why shouldn't the law determine what technology can and cannot do?
Hi, Nikhil. It's a very relevant question that you have posed. And the answer is in two parts, really. Like, a law can possibly not mandate technology to do a particular thing in terms of a positive mandate, like please do X hereinafter. That would imply that law is dictating how technological innovation happens or the pace thereof. That's absolutely not within the realm of law at all. It's impossible for either lawyers or judges or policymakers to determine what is actually in the domain of my other panelists, the engineers. Now, that is one part of it. Law surely can't do that. The other side of it is, can law ask you to not deploy a particular type of technology? Now, that negative injunction is possibly something which can be legally enforced. The question is that injunction in law must also satisfy certain other conditions of legality. Must, in the present circumstance with regard to end-to-end encryption, I believe this dovetails into the primordial query that whether there is a right to anonymously exist or communicate online. If it can be determined that there is no such right, then law surely can injunct it in whatever form, as Rahul has previously mentioned, that it might be a requirement of a parliamentary law and not necessarily a subordinate legislation as these rules presently are. But then that will fall within the domain of law. But what we really need to look at for the present analysis is that whether there is a right to anonymous communication online and whether law can injunct that.
So, is it possible for the law to tell a platform that is built to not know who sends what message, to actually track and know who has sent which message at all times? How does that affect Puttaswamy? Or how is that affected by Puttaswamy?
I'll take Puttaswamy a little separately. Now, with regard to a platform which is architectured on the idea of anonymous communication or private communication, at times the word anonymous is kind of takes a negative feel with it, though for no good reason. But so the privacy of that communication is ensured, and that is encrypted as end-to-end communication, end-to-end encryption on the platform itself. Now, inasmuch as that business exercise of that particular platform was legal, there is nothing proscribing it even today after the subordinate legislation, after the rules have been put in force. There is nothing which proscribes this right to undertake or to have a business on a platform which is end-to-end encrypted. So, therefore, there needs to be an injunction against that, and the backhanded effort through a subordinate legislation is definitely not sufficient to bring that forth. And that there we will go in a cycle in terms of, again, figuring it out whether there is a right to anonymous communication.
So just to play devil's advocate here, if you think about if you look at the Rajya Sabha report on child pornography and child sexual abuse material, they actually mandate that the government should be allowed to break encryption in order to intercept child pornographers. But I think one of the challenges with end-to-end encryption is the presence of plausible deniability within the signal protocol, right? So they can't, even if they get something, they can't necessarily use it as evidence. So and that impacts legal processes across the board. So what's wrong in demanding a technological change that ensures that the communication that is intercepted, received, can actually be used as actual evidence? What's wrong with that?
In principle, there is nothing wrong with that policy call. The problem is how it is to be implemented. Now, what we see has happened with the 2021 IT Act rules is that a sledgehammer is taken, something, a metaphor which was being used by Rahul some time back, that with the one sledgehammer, they have kind of painted everyone in the same brush, forgetting that there are classifications which are required because not all entities are of the same kind, of the same type. And therefore, a nuanced approach was what was necessary. And now that is a legal requirement under the Kuttoswamy decision, proportionality of the actions which are being undertaken by the government. One prong of that test is the proportionality of the action taken, which is unreasonable if it is to be expected that for few bad actors, the entire protocol has to be changed. For few bad actors, a particular right, which according to me, in my humble opinion, is a right under the Constitution of anonymous private communication online, has to be completely done away with. This violates Kuttoswamy even on that third prong of the proportionality test, and therefore not sustainable in my view.
Deban, you wanted to respond to something?
Yeah, I mean, worldwide, whenever governments want to do something that they don't want to argue about, they use child porn and terrorism, right? Those are the standard. I mean, China's obscenity laws, same stuff, really.
They're also using disinformation now.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the government keeps asking for transparency from its citizens instead of the other way around, which I'm very confused about till date. Here are some facts. End-to-end encrypted systems exist. Fact 2, the internet is a global phenomenon. All right. You can't say that you're not allowed to download app X. If I'm a criminal and I know that all these local applications are not going to, are going to sort of, if I'm running a child porn ring and I know if I use WhatsApp, I can get tracked, I wouldn't use WhatsApp. I'm going to use something else that I can find elsewhere on the internet.
Right.
So who are the only people whose security is being affected? It's the law-abiding citizens.
Yeah, I was just saying that people jump from BlackBerry to another platform once.
Yeah. And basically, like, I mean, the way I see it in terms of, you asked about the feasibility of doing this.
Yeah.
In a real world system, the feasibility of doing this depends on your many definitions. But the way I see it at the end of the day, yes, India has a right and requirement to make all sorts of laws. Absolutely. There may be very good reasons. But if the laws of the Republic of India come into conflict with the laws of mathematics, I know which one's going to win. Right? So the problem is that at some point, something's got to give. You have to respect the laws of the natural world first, and then you make laws that fit that circumstance. You can't just say this should happen. Okay, no murders should happen from now on. Great. Now what? Right? Like it's infeasible.
In fact, it is almost like let daggers be banned, lest there should be murders.
Well, it's the same argument as banning cars from the road because there are accidents. But, there is still, I mean, I'm just arguing from the side of the government here, there is a legitimate state interest in determining or using as evidence a message that has allegedly been sent by a child pornographer. And if technology prevents that from happening, from that, and Deban, correct me if I'm wrong, right? Is there plausible deniability built into the signal protocol? And so therefore, wouldn't that also impact legitimate issues in legitimate cases?
Yes. So I have two answers for that. One, yes, there's something called off the record built into it. I don't know how much legal weight that actually has, because people might say, look, these people whom we caught don't have the expertise to possibly fool OTR or whatever, maybe. The other thing is, I'm not sure I buy that argument that you just made, which is the government has a legitimate reason for wanting blah, blah, blah. I think it's possible. I agree with you. It might be possible, but I want to see the data first. Because all too often we are told that there is a legitimate reason for doing X. The problem is technology, like we're talking over Zoom, right? Where we have lights in our, we're getting all of these benefits and you're suddenly saying, I don't want this tiny corner case of badness to happen. Doesn't work that way, right? If police officers can coordinate a wide area search using phone calls, the terrorists can also use phone calls perhaps to get out of the way. If you jam both of them. So it's like you need to make a decision. I think Mr. Banerjee was also saying the same thing. At some point, you need to make a decision about what's allowed and what's not. And right now, if this is allowed, then it's got to be allowed. You can't, all of this stuff about traceability is just hogwash. It's just, pretense. The usual argument I hear, by the way, from laypersons is, oh, WhatsApp has this forwarded many times feature.
Actually, that's one of the questions we got. So I'll just read that out. If the label forwarded many times is applied as soon as the message has been forwarded through a chain of 5 chats tracked via a counter, why can't the originator be traced using only the metadata pertaining to the originator?
So WhatsApp doesn't know. That number is unreadable to WhatsApp. In fact, the whole system, that system of forwarding, that's not even properly secure. If I ran a fake version of WhatsApp's app, I could mess around with that and change that counter to whatever I wanted. The reason that this forwarded many times thing ends up working is because WhatsApp's assumption is if a message spreads like wildfire, then presumably most of the users doing it are legitimate users using legitimate versions of the app. And therefore, at some point, they'll see this thing, even if there are bad actors in between. But here, if we're talking about a single bad actor, that's say me pretending to be you, Nikhil, if you have some sort of feature that says, oh, Nikhil's phone number is just attached at the bottom of the message somehow, half my students could build something that fools that. Right? Like we actually went, I was teaching the Signal protocol in class when this happened. And we went over, let's say, Count Cote's proposals and so on and so forth. And like my students broke that in like, actually in the first answer, it was the first hand up. So it's like, these are not, how should I put this? The Signal protocol, there's a reason why it's used by so many people, right? It took decades for us to get this far. It's a beautiful system. It's built on these wonderful, simple mathematical assumptions. And you've built all the stuff on top. And you know this about math. All of us presumably have done some amount of axiomatic math at some point. If you fiddle around with the foundations, if you say, oh, in geometry, I'm going to change this rule about parallel lines never meeting, which you can, right? Parallel lines do sometimes meet. Look at the longitudes of the earth. You move to spherical non-planar geometry and you can make that happen. The moment you change those rules, however, half your decisions sort of go haywire because everything you've built on top of it falls apart. And then, oh, I changed this, now I need to fix that, now I need to fix that, now I need to fix that, right? I'm not saying it can't be done. There are techniques. I can maybe think of some sort of homomorphic encryption technique, secret sharing, blah, blah, blah. There's so many different things people have come up with over the years. And I am a big believer in human ingenuity. The problem is what the government's asking for right now appears to be A, vaguely worded, B, thinking about a version of instant messaging that existed in the 90s. If mentioning alphanumeric hashing is like saying colored paint. The moment anyone says that, you begin to suspect they're not an artist, right? And then C, you need to have these conversations first, right? You need to have these conversations for a year before you can decide to make rules like this. Because this isn't some fiddly tiny thing that some grad students can poke at for a week and fix. These are extremely complex.
To be fair to the government here, they had put up a proposal for this almost 2 years ago. And there weren't many from the technology side who responded to those proposals to contest them. It's been almost 2 years to the date, in fact.
So perhaps I'm not the best person to answer that because I hadn't heard of this. So maybe they should have like promulgated it further or talked to more people. But I know many of the cryptographers involved, right? there's a fixed set of advanced cryptographers in India. It's not a very big crowd. And I don't know any of them that were approached by the government to come in and help build these in collaboration with all of these big entities. What they could have done perhaps was put this forth first and said, we're releasing this in a year. Come and talk to us.
But they did approach Kamakoti. And he did.
Okay. I don't want, look, he's a very senior person. I'm sure he had good intentions when building that protocol. That those solutions carry no security guarantees whatsoever.
Okay. Yash, any responses to these? I mean, is breaking end-to-end encryption a foolproof way of achieving traceability?
So breaking, so just before I get into that, right, to counter the previous discussion, to touch on that as well. So, the question you asked earlier was, is the government justified in asking for these communications to be intercepted, right? So, taking just the child porn example, so let's think about the chain of events that takes place, right? So first you have the camera that's essentially used, right? So one part of the solution can we get camera manufacturers and cell phone manufacturers to hash and upload hashes of all the images on the world, right? So the point being, there's a lot of chains in that process where we could do a blatant data collection across the board. So doing it just at the end-to-end encryption point, I mean, all of them are equally flawed, of course. I'm not advocating for any of them. My point being, asking every camera in the world to upload a hash to the government is essentially as ridiculous as is asking them to hash every message or every communication in the world and putting it out there, right? So I'm just trying to add that into context. So that's one on that part. Coming to end-to-end encryption, right? So would breaking end-to-end encryption solve this issue? I don't think so, right? So as Debayan mentioned, and I mean, I think it's common sense, right? Second, you break end-to-end encryption, people are going to move to different platforms. So that's absolute number one, right? And we've seen this historically. We've seen this, I mean, if you look back 15 years in terms of the gangsters and terrorists that, I mean, and the police going after them, right? When cell phone interception became common, they moved to email. When email interception became common, they moved to Skype. That technology evolution is always going to take place, and the bad guys are always going to find safe havens. So whether it's, I mean, if we talk about child pornography right now, right? Whether it's moving to the dark web, where it becomes even harder now for the government to sort of track that, right? And the next request is going to be, let's decentralize and let's monitor the dark web. So the point is, every time you break one level of encryption or one level of security, you're essentially going to have the bad guys move to a different, harder to reach platform. And then again, it's going to keep cycling on from there, right? There'll always be an easier, non-trackable way to communicate, even if it's simply going to Zomato and adding reviews and using code words there, right? There's always going to be some platform available. So that's never really going to help. The second part of this is, right? And what I think is not really being addressed so much, the Indian government has a lot of security issues, right? We've seen that in the last couple of months with a ton of papers coming out in terms of privacy issues, security issues with government assets being hacked and all these things going on, right? So the other part of this equation, right? Let's take for granted, let's assume that their ask is completely legitimate. Let's assume that they're able to actually go and by break end-to-end encryption, let's assume that they're able to make all of this work, right? What happens next? Do we have the technological and security skill set to actually do this in a way where China or somebody else is not going to get hold of these keys and just destroy the information security of this country, right? You're going to have corporates, governments, everybody essentially completely compromised. No communication that takes place, whether on a business, government, security, intelligence, whatever the purpose might be, right, will have any integrity essentially, integrity or confidentiality left to it, because if somebody on the bad guy side is able to get the keys that are being used as part of to allow the government access to this communication, or able to compromise certain machines that are being used for it, right? All of it starts failing from there. And it's a sort of a domino effect from there, right? So the question is also that is the price of potentially putting all our communications, every single one at risk, worth the value that they're sort of asking for in this context, right? And let me put it this way, the government's, I mean, it's taken the government about what, 6, 7, 8 years since the government put an order out saying all government departments shouldn't use Gmail email addresses. And I still get emails pretty much every week from Gmail addresses, right? So it's taken them 7 years for that. How long is it going to take for them to leave WhatsApp and move to whatever government platform that comes up?
Well, I don't think they're going to be able to unless NIC gets its act together. But Priyo, just, there is one part of this rules that say that on a, just can less intrusive means be adopted? I mean, how do you explain what is less intrusive or more intrusive to a ministry? Who judges what is less intrusive or more intrusive means of being able to identify the originator? Is there a need for narrowing this provision, and how can it be narrowed?
Very honestly, I think that the proviso with regard to the least intrusive method is just another of those legal artifices to be plugged in such that when this matter is litigated in court, one can say that the balancing act has been legislatively undertaken. As we heard from our experts, that it is simply not technologically possible. Like, I am no technological expert. I'll have to rely on what comes from our experts. Now, according to them, that breaking the end-to-end encryption, without breaking the end-to-end encryption, traceability is just not possible, then in that circumstance, it's a meaningless proviso which has been put in just to garnish the legislation for the benefit of the judiciary at a future date. It serves no purpose. And if what the experts are saying is correct, there is no narrowing down which is possible. This is kind of like a binary scenario. It's either this or that.
So how is the court going to view this? They will end up accepting it, right? That then the government is not trying to dictate technology. They're telling you if there's another way of doing it, then you have an option.
In fact, I personally believe that practically it will be an uphill task for whoever is the petitioner who is challenging it on this specific ground. It will require affidavits like was attempted even during the Aadhaar litigation. There must be technical affidavits which needs to be put forth to the government explaining in precisely and clearly why it is technologically not possible to undertake what the proviso is saying. Or the proviso itself is salutary, so the proviso should stay on book. Probably the entire section should go. That's what my point is.
Okay.
It will be a technical litigation. Essentially, we'll have to rely on the munificence, patience of the bench to hear out petitioners pointing out these particulars of the problems that they are facing in terms of the law.
So there's the other thing was, why do you think there wasn't an exception for private communications versus groups? Would a Telegram-like solution be agreeable to everyone? Priyo?
Nikhil? I haven't really given this a thought, Nikhil, very honestly. I haven't really given this a thought because I'm not very familiar with the architectures of all the various different messaging platforms.
Telegram, you think there might be a different approach taken to one-to-one communications versus groups?
I doubt whether that itself is practically possible, because the government is also trying to bring within its net. The exceptions which are now carved out are fairly broad. Sovereignty, security of the state, public order, which inherently entails tracking bad actors who are planning, scheming against the government, trying to create public unrest, so on and so forth, which will happen in the medium of not necessarily forwards. It will happen in the nature of private communications, which they probably are trying to target over there.
But those grounds are essentially under 19.2. Aren't there also restrictions to, in case law on those grounds?
There are restrictions, but unfortunately, there are some case laws as well, which puts a premium on the fact that a very high official of the government has been put in that decision-making authority. So, which is something which they have clearly imbibed over here. And therefore, again, that will be a challenge to practically cull this out before court.
So I'd also like to quickly come in and sort of underscore something Yash just said before this idea of, if you give the government this extra power of this master key or whatever, some extra power, what you're doing is you're taking a good system that works across the world and you're creating a separate point of failure for it. And that point of failure is going to become a prime target for hackers. Now, given that India's cyber infrastructure, let's say, is not better than, I don't know, the US's, and given that the US has managed to lose major parts of its blueprints for the F-35 Mark II Lightning to its SF-86 security firms from the Office of Personnel Management to God knows what else, and the Indian government also seems to be losing data all the time, like, I don't see how or why they're going to be able to keep this kind of tantalizing target safe from any kind of bad actors. And the second thing is, tracing exists, right? You do it the way you do it for anything else. Go one by one. I mean, both others have said it. Like, you just go to one person and they show you something. Okay, who sent it? Go to that person. Who sent it? Go to that person. I mean, this idea of shortcutting everything is like, would you do that to the postal system? How? Would you require the postal system to look inside every envelope and keep track of every message that was sent so that if a threatening message was received by the President of India, you could immediately track it back to the first person who wrote that message rather than the 15 intermediaries it went through? Is that what we're saying, that we now require the postal system to do that? Because that is the exact equivalent of what has been proposed.
Just on a technical side, how does this impact disappearing messages? Or how would they be allowed if platforms were to be architected to identify the originator?
Disappearing messages wouldn't really be disappearing anymore. At the very least, platforms would be required to keep some kind of hash or something for some significant period of time.
Okay. I'm just curious if anyone also wants, from the audience, wants to jump in on this and share their views. Can we see a show of hands if anyone has a point of view on this? Rahul, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Sorry, Nikhil, I missed the question. Could you just repeat?
No, I mean, do you have any thoughts on end-to-end on the traceability part of these rules?
Absolutely. In fact, we were talking earlier about the
From a constitutional perspective, Rahul, how do you think that will play out?
No, it's completely disproportionate. As I think Devayan was talking about the similar rule, if it were to be imposed for the postal system, how inconvenient it would be. And like the example which I gave earlier holds true again, in terms of when Supreme Court thought it was completely disproportionate to link your Aadhaar numbers to phone calls on the assumption that terrorists also use phones. They said not everybody in this country is a terrorist. I think the similar thing would be completely the same thing could be said with response to this as well. The object of the exercise, this is the far from being the least. This is the most restrictive means of achieving the object which is ought to be realized. If the object itself is actually one which should be realized. So yes, I completely agree. This is unconstitutional, and I've been hearing this discussion as well in part of this discussion on whether the rules can require the platforms to re-engineer the way they actually work. I think this is again a gross, an unreasonable restriction on their right to do business. It's one thing to say that if you are doing something that you keep doing that in a particular way, or you do that in this thing, but this is telling them to do it in a completely different way. Their software is going to have, I mean, the way they operate is going to have to be completely changed in order to fulfill this requirement, which I think is completely unreasonable.
And how does it play out from a Puttaswamy perspective? I mean, isn't there, it's in Puttaswamy, there's a reasonable restriction to privacy, right? That if they need to identify the originator of a message, if they need to identify in one case, and isn't that then proportionate to seek that information for that one case? Do platforms have the right to, in those instances, say that we don't, our architecture is such that we are unable to track this information?
That's exactly right. I mean, you can't ask an impossible act. The actual truth of the matter is that the advantages that the government will get being able to trace this one originator are far outweighed by the disadvantages that this would entail for any kind of anonymous speech. I mean, I think the actual impact of this is that whether any entity likes it or not, this is pretty much the end of anonymous speech. Because if everything is going to be stored for 180 days regardless of anything, and if there are always a kind of I don't know, like a Hansel and Gretel kind of trail which is going to come back to you, then you will obviously think very carefully about what you're saying in public, right? Which means that all controversial speech, all secret speech, all of that is no longer is no longer going to be possible.
But Debayan, there does seem to be global consensus, or at least amongst some of the most powerful countries, the Five Eyes, for example, and I think India has also signed that letter against end-to-end encryption. How is this playing out in the technology side of things? How do they view the government's demand?
I mean, very badly. Like this isn't going to work. Like if every country has a backdoor, then would India use software that it knows is backdoored by the US? Then every country needs to develop its own parallel software, and then it's just operationally it's meaningless. Okay, it's not going to happen. What is much clearer actually on the cost benefit side is that, okay, we've discussed the costs a lot, right? On the benefit side, all data that we have till now indicates that the story that we're telling, that, oh, once we have access, we'll be able to catch all these bad people, is bunk, right? It doesn't work. This happened with the NSA. So the NSA was collecting this huge amount of data, phone records, yada, 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 much deeper than any of this WhatsApp stuff that we're talking about. Stellar Winds and all of those programs that came after. You may have heard Ed Snowden stuff, you know? So the US Senate Intelligence Committee asked the NSA to come and say, you know, you've sunk $40 billion or whatever into this, you know, what have you got for us? So they named some numbers. They said, oh, we've stopped like 54 or something terrorist attacks. And they were like, oh, if you've stopped 54 9/11s, that's brilliant. Can you tell us more? And then that number kept going down. 10, 7, 5. Eventually, the NSA has revealed one single case where bulk surveillance made a difference. They revealed 4 cases, 3 of them bulk surveillance made no difference. Even the classified cases, the vast majority of them, what they've told us is that it's traditional methods that got them their targets. In that one case where bulk surveillance made a difference after sinking billions of dollars into it, and you can look this up, it's crazy enough that you should. It was a taxi driver in California who tried to wire $8,500 to his brother in Somalia, to Al-Shabaab. That's it. That's everything that the NSA had to show for its huge bulk surveillance scheme. And this is crazy enough that I invite all of you to go look this up yourself, right? Here's a fun little link for panelists and attendees. I looked this up recently for another discussion. So it's like, these people are asking for stuff, fine. That stuff costs a lot. Great. Can you show us the benefits? Show us the data. How many cases are stuck because of this? Who are the people involved? Can you show us some amount of data? Because worldwide, of course, governments want to see more transparency from their citizens and not the other way around. Of course, everyone wants that. But if we need to give up our rights, even partially for some reason, at least me as a citizen of India, I want to see the data before I give up a single line of text.
So how about thinking solutions here, right? What are the alternatives? What can governments do?
So I can give you a simple short-term fake alternative. This isn't really the case. Have warrants like we do for phone searches. I don't know if this is possible at all or not legally, but technologically it's possible. That is within, let's say, I mean, and it has the same trouble in the sense that people will shift out of, let's say, WhatsApp to some other service. But technically, you could just do an if-then. That is, within WhatsApp, there's a legitimate actual system, and there's a plain text system that doesn't encrypt anything. And if the Indian government serves WhatsApp with a warrant against Nikhil Power, What WhatsApp does is it changes a number inside WhatsApp to 1. And from now on, everything Nikhil does is unencrypted or something, right? From now on, it can't do anything about previous communications. But even this doesn't, the answer is fake, because if Nikhil was evil, he wouldn't be using WhatsApp, or he'd be using a customized version of WhatsApp or something. You can perhaps keep track of current communications that appear to be coming from a certain phone number, perhaps. But looking at past data, all of this stuff, that's not really going to work. And even what I said, that's just sort of very vague. It needs to be really nailed down to understand whether that's possible or not.
Okay. Yash, your solutions, alternatives?
So I'll put it this way, right? I don't think there is a interception-based technology solution to this problem, right? It's not the answer to the problem. Like Debayan said, the NSA has already done this, and we have a result on that, right? Where it didn't really work. Technology can play a role. I mean, in the child pornography context, say, for example, the FBI has portals online where you can go and help them identify hotel rooms or clothing or paintings that will in turn help them, locate missing children or things of that nature, right? I think interception-based technology is not going to really solve these problems. Traditional policing, traditional trafficking, traditional methods that exist and actually work are the ones where we need to invest more into. Whether it's better technology for them to be able to do their job better, more coordinated, more communication between those teams and those departments and those people, but just mass intercepting trillions and trillions and trillions of messages in the hopes that we can then go and search child porn and find exactly the 8 people that are doing it is not going to work, right? I mean, the bad guys are never going to use that plain language, and B, you're going to have a really high false positive rate, right? So I think, I mean, all of us have seen activists working in the traditional sector to help prevent child trafficking, sex trafficking. We've seen, of course, great police work in terms of whether it's anti-terrorism, and all of them are massively underfunded, right? So money may be better spent funding the things that work, as opposed to trying to a blanket solution that might result in more problems than solutions.
Okay. Priyo, any legal solutions and how this could be drafted differently, maybe?
Do away with the subclassifications and leave it for regulations, such that they can be formulated on a case-by-case basis. Just do away with this, because this creates more complication, more uncertainty, more vagueness, and therefore more abuse. Nothing good can come out of this. That is what my limited submission is.
So there's a question from Nathaniel Andrews who say that if there is such a switch that is turned on by WhatsApp, I think this is to Debayan, does the person need to know that a warrant has been issued, because that's a principle of natural justice in law?
So you can, I mean, in many cases, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, I'm not a legal expert. The police do listen in on people without them knowing, with a warrant, without them knowing, right? But even what I said, like the problem is that once this fact is known that WhatsApp can do this, the criminals will stop using WhatsApp and move to another service. Right. So it's not really a solution. I agree with Yash and Priyadarshi completely that any kind of interception-based tactic, any kind of interference in this it's not going to lead anywhere good, because the problems aren't just technical. They're almost operational or philosophical even. Right. And unless you solve that basic issue is, do you wish to allow citizens to conduct private communications? Yes or no? Until you answer that question, clearly it's not going to work out.
Okay, Debayan, another question from you from Namrata. Is there a way to technically implement such a switch for a user X without also compromising end-to-end encryption and privacy and security for users A, B, and C with whom the user X communicates?
Not really, because what I'm doing effectively is I'm acting as a man in the middle. So I'm pretending to be Nikhil, and I'm getting all the messages from Nikhil and for Nikhil, and I'm just communicating them to Nikhil. So everyone connected to Nikhil's network would also be necessarily compromised. like I said, I mean, this is not a good solution. This is what happens. Like I said, once you fiddle around with the bottom of the pyramid, the whole thing just falls apart. Right?
Yeah, Rahul, you wanted to say something?
Two things. In fact, I think Dipayan's idea is actually really, really good. I don't know if Priyadarshi will remember this, but from our right to privacy case thing, we had particularly argued this, that, this is not a general warrant, and there needs to be a specific warrant if you need to look at individuals. And I think this problem that, if, for example, we surveil one person's WhatsApp, the people who he talks to are also compromised. It's the same thing for telephones as well. So the real answer to this is that you have to have surveillance reform. In America, for example, you need a FISA warrant and it has to comply with the rigorous requirements of the Fourth Amendment. In India, our surveillance reform is pretty much non-existent. We have the PUCL case from the 1990s, which says that a certain bureaucrats sitting, I think they're joint secretary level, I think, who decide on whether somebody's phone has to be tapped or not. So I believe they do hundreds of cases, thousands of cases a day. There's no real investigation into this. So I would say that if it is indeed possible for WhatsApp to do this, to look at two individual cases, then let the warrant is actually a pretty good system. I agree that this may not solve the problem in the end, that they will go to somewhere else, but surely that is the story of human nature, right? I mean, you haven't been able to stop bad things from happening since the time of Adam and Eve. Bad things will happen. The point is, how do you control bad things from happening in a way that does not destroy the good things from happening?
Well, Rahul, even the FISA code warrants are secretive, right? So
they have to be. I mean, by definition, if you know that your phone is being tapped, then there's no point tapping your phone, right? But the idea, the way the system is supposed to work is that your phone will only be tapped if reasonable people decided it has to be tapped. So typically, that's not in other countries. It's not only the government making that decision. There's also somebody from the judiciary who may be more aware of rights. Maybe privacy activists as well. The people making the decision to surveil you aren't the ones who directly benefit from it. So for example, they would take care to ensure that the opposition leaders are not unnecessarily surveilled. If you look at the European case law on this, they think that the mere possibility of surveillance is bad enough to strike everything down. We had in fact cited these cases before the Supreme Court as well in Aadhaar. Unfortunately, I don't recall whether they even referred to these judgments. But Roman Zakharov, I think, is one of them from Russia. The European Court of Human Rights. The possibility of surveillance is bad enough to violate your right to privacy.
So I'm just reminded of something that we were saying during Aadhaar is this a solution looking for a problem to latch onto?
I think if you are to quote another metaphor at you, if you are a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. It's you have this, so therefore you can do that. That seems to me to be one way to look at things.
So we will. I think we have Mr. Rakesh Maheshwari with us. So are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
So I think there are lots of issues and lots of points which have been raised. I was wondering if you would like to share your views and your comments. I know we're starting a little early, but since we have you here, I thought we might want to explore your views on these rules that you've been so closely involved with architecting.
Yeah, so first of all, good evening to all of you. And in fact, I am not party, or I was not, I was listening to some of the earlier views very early in the program, but thereafter I was not, I should say, into the conversation and therefore have lost the points. Would like to say certain things. First of all, the intent of these rules from our side had been that there should be a safe and secure ecosystem for the users, various platform users in the country. Some higher level of accountability for all the intermediaries, and in particular about the social media, significant social media platforms. Let's first of all understand, some of the reasons which prompted us to make the changes the way they have been made right now. So to begin with, few, of course, share single, everybody knows. Then there was Prajula court case, wherein almost every tech company, I mean, the big platforms were party to it. Government was party to it in certain decisions which happened in the court. The advocates from both the sides. So there was practically a complete unanimous in all the decisions that happened. And the clear recommendation in the Prajula case was that you need to curb. In fact, the court has used a very harsh word, is eliminate. The child sexual abuse, the rape, gang rape imagery, and the very fact, the very question from where it started was that is it really possible that something which has been detected to be unlawful on internet on a particular platform, is it really possible that the same thing is not reloaded? In fact, the question was prevention, but where we agreed was that it should be possible. It should be possible not to allow uploading of the same digitally identical content on the same platform. And that's where, I mean, it was agreed that maybe something on such issues need to be done. Then, of course, there was also Rajya Sabha committee on ad hoc committee on pornography. There were certain recommendations which were made. Very recently, there were few court cases like X versus Union of India. And once again, the courts, in fact, one of the decision has come just about 3-4 days back. Once again, the courts were looking for as to how the larger solution can be achieved. So these were some of the cases. And of course, the draft, which we released in December 2018, the subsequent comments which we received over a period of time, and a lot of discussions which have happened during all this period. Maybe at times we saw that the rules are getting stuck. Rules are not really, we are not really able to move forward. But then we also felt the need to have some sort of a rules for the just declared AOBR for allocation of business rules for MIB. And that is where, because of the requirement for rules to be published for them, the fact that our rules were already waiting in the pipeline, and because we thought that in the given scenario, given the condition, I mean, given the limitations of the act that we have as of now, that the best route will be to have this combined rule covering intermediaries as well as publishers. The VOD platforms and the online news platforms has been published today. From the intermediary perspective, while I mean there were one or two more cases, in fact, wherein particularly the statements were that the platforms have been deleting or have been suspending the accounts of the people of their own, maybe with their knowledge or without their knowledge. So because the way the cases are coming, or with the way the cases were coming up in the court, they were all claiming that it was done without their knowledge. We don't really know. But then we realized that why not in certain cases that the option, at least some sort of a warning, advance warning be given by the platform to the people, I mean, to the users, before their accounts are suspended for maybe violation of the platform's policy. So it was all those reasons which have culminated into the present version of the rules. Now, beyond this, I also completely agree that there is no one-stop solution. The way the intermediaries have grown, the kind of complexities which have come up over a period of time, with the fact that and the constraint that the IT Act, for example, has not been able to keep up pace with the changing requirements, that three-tier sort of a structure has been created as of now. Now, as far as those rules which are meant for all the intermediaries are concerned, there is practically no major change except for the fact that some terms and conditions for the users, which are more of guidance to the users from the platform side, are conveyed. And that is where we have emphatically, conveyed that fake news is something which needs to be addressed to. Of course, certain record retention period has also been increased, whether the user deletes its account or the platform deletes account or of its own, or the platform removes a particular account at the instance of the court or the government, that in all these three cases, the requirement of keeping certain information about the users has been increased from 90 days to 180 days. And this particularly was felt in those particular cases where the user himself removed it or the platform removed the account, and maybe subsequent investigations required the data to be there and it was not available. So per se, because of the storage not being too costly and the kind of information which has been otherwise available with the platform, if the user continues to be with the platform, this information otherwise also remains with the platform. So this is where it has been increased. Simultaneously, we have wanted that the user should be made aware of the terms and conditions in maybe in whichever way the platform wants to convey it. Maybe in our December 2018 guideline, draft, we had mentioned that it should be done periodically on a monthly basis. But we realized that, given the number of apps that anybody will be using, the number of intermediary platforms that anybody will be interacting with, this will become an onerous, and practically, people will tend to, of course, tend to just ignore such kind of messages. We have increased the frequency. In fact, we have decreased the frequency to once in 12 months. Rest, most of the things are more or less on the same lines as were there in 2011 rules. Now, coming to the significant social media. So first of all, I'll talk about the social media itself. Yes, it's true. Because that's when I was party to some of the discussions which took place. It's true that in the present version, the way the definition of social media has come out can be quite broad and quite be misunderstood. And for that reason, see, our aim is not to have more and more platforms being declared as the significant social media platforms. The whole intent is that wherever the risk is and wherever the platform is reasonably large enough, that those platforms should be considered as significant. And to that extent, we have already started working on maybe putting up a clarification as to what constitutes a social media platform. And because maybe some definition has already gone into the PDP bill. Let's hope the PDP bill becomes a reality in the coming monsoon session. If and as and when the parliament is held, actually the definition of social media for that reason will come out, will maybe with a better version as and when the PDP bill becomes a reality. But for the time being, as I mentioned, the intent is not to have more and more platforms. The intent is to those platforms which have which clearly provide the possibility of higher and higher social interaction, which have a possibility of content going viral, which have a potential to cause damage, and which are otherwise not in the specific or I should say the niche domain, whether it is a business domain or whether it's within the organization or maybe for a specific kind of a activity that you are carrying out. Maybe such platforms should not be considered as the social media platforms. So So ideally, whichever leaked version was being talked of is what we are looking at when we are talking of the definition of the social media platform. Now, having said so, see, the problem as of today, which is being felt, is that while we have the larger platforms available and providing services in the country, legally, they all absolve themselves by saying that the Indian counterparts, the way they are operating today is not the ones which are providing services in the country. So we ended up talking to faceless entities which are providing services in India, but who do not directly understand the culture and the sensitivities of the Indian mindset. And for that reason only, that the concept of the chief compliance officer, the nodal officer, and the grievance officer, the resident grievance officer, has been brought in picture, because there are a large number of cases also wherein when you were writing grievances or when you were making grievances to them, maybe not even acknowledgements were being made. And then because you are not really sure whether your grievance has reached there or not, maybe you were also writing to California or to Ireland by post that your grievance is at least reaching there and hopefully gets heard. And for that reason, and in fact, in so many court cases, that the Indian entities stood once again apart compared to, whatever their US or European counterpart were. Therefore, we have asked them to have an office here in India, which does not at all mean, because taxation is not our intent as far as Ministry of Electronics and IT is concerned, but definitely accountability of these platforms to the Indian citizen, to the Indian user, and to the government should remain, because it is the responsibility of the government to provide a safe, secure environment to the citizen. Now, going back with the Prajula case again, now, and on the number of complaints that are continuously being received, that we also went beyond, in fact, the act to say that in certain scenarios we have, in fact, avoided the word revenge porn. We have avoided the word victim, but we have conveyed that if an individual's privacy is breached, and privacy of certain nature is breached, if the person gets impersonated, or if there are, say, deep fakes and more images of the person which are created, then we have in fact empowered those people to be able to directly reach out to the platforms, to any intermediary platform for that reason, and to see resolution of their problem. Once again, we are working on few SOPs so as to ensure that sometimes people may not be directly able to reach out. Not everybody is well conversant with the act, with the internet, and not everybody be user of that particular platform. So while you may not be the user, while you may not be conversant with it, as to how do we still facilitate an easier reporting and an earlier resolution. So we are trying to work out some 3-4 options, wherein the platforms will also be given an option to, maybe they are also being encouraged to come up with trusted flaggers. Some of them already have. So if a trusted flagger brings it to your knowledge, if the law enforcement brings it to your knowledge, if the person directly approaches, or if the person approaches through one of his authorized or her authorized, I should say, through some authorization mechanism, that the grievance in such cases should be expeditiously heard and taken care of. The same now applies that initially, say, as per 2011 rules, there was 36 hours of time for acknowledgement and 30 days for resolution. So with the change of technologies, with the ability to say, for example, give an auto acknowledgement, that these timelines have also been revisited, and the timelines therefore have been changed to 24 hours and 15 days, which does not mean that every case has to be done within 15 days, but definitely every platform must make an earnest effort. And for some reason, if they're not really able to do it within the stipulated time, whether it is 24 hours or 15 days or maybe 36 hours or 72 hours, that's how the various timelines have been defined in the rules. Let there be an earnest, I should say, attempt, one. Two, let there be an acknowledgement that because of all these reasons, or maybe because of one or two of these reasons, exceptions can always be there. I mean, the rules, unfortunately, do not work the way the industry works. For example, I mean, I have also worked in so many e-governance projects wherein we try to define the SLAs that 90% of the time you should be able to solve this particular problem, or the website should be able to come within whatever X amount of time. So unfortunately, given the wide variety of intermediaries that we have, and to have as simple as possible rules that we need to have, maybe the expectations have been set. Thereafter, it is always on a one-to-one basis, on a case-to-case basis, that the actual timelines can be decided. But if there is an acknowledgement, if the reasons for delay, if any, becomes clear, I'm sure, I mean, it's more important is that the due diligence is done rather than we just stick on to whatever timelines have been defined. However, simultaneously, I will also like to mention that if there is a systemic failure, if you don't really define if you don't tune your system, if you don't increase maybe in some cases the moderators, then of course, as a system, you will not be able to adhere to those timelines, which is what exposes you to you then lose the intermediary exemptions have been given under the law. So while the law was very clear right from day one that the intermediaries are being exempted, subject to certain due diligence. Now, these due diligence, as you do not follow these due diligence, earlier also, I mean, because the doubts have been raised that there are criminal provisions. Unfortunately, it is because the Act already had criminal provisions. So if an extant law whichever extant law is being violated, you become vulnerable to that. But once again, that's not our intent. Our intent is compliance. Our intent is that in one-off case, if some things go wrong, nobody should be chased. And therefore, particularly say, for example, with respect to Chief Compliance Officer, we have very categorically conveyed that once again, that an opportunity has to be given before anything is acted upon. So I will like to use this platform to convey that it is not the aim of the government to chase the Chief Compliance Officer, or for that reason the intermediary, and for every possible scenario maybe look forward and communicate that maybe you have lost your exemption. We are only looking forward when there are a clear willful defiance, systemic failures, and that too we will be trying to address as much as possible. I mean, at least that's our aim, through the mechanisms that are being established, through the mechanism of Chief Compliance Officer and nodal officers that are being requested in certain, particularly certain larger platforms. It is also possible that sometimes few intermediaries, which may not be, falling into the categories of social media, significant social media platforms, but have a significant risk. The government once again has the ability to maybe relook at the risk level. There can be particularly hyper local intermediaries, which can, if they are becoming a risk, then only we will have the rules provide you to have an option to declare them also as significant, and one or more risks one or more due diligence, as is expected from a significant social media platforms, also becomes applicable to them.
Sir, I have lots of questions.
Yeah, please. Now I'm open. Okay.
Sir,
no issues.
So first up, sir, will this SOP that you're working on, will it be opened up for consultation? Will it be notified in the Gazette? Like what kind of...
First of all, SOPs will not be notified in the Gazette. SOPs are only meant for... SOPs are meant to support the rules and in no way replace the rules themselves. However, SOP set the expectations that the intermediary platforms can have, and the government can have, and the citizen can have. So because once again, the rule are setting certain expectations, or they are setting certain principles. The way they need to be implemented.
Will the rules, with what kind of legal backing will the SOPs have? How can they be enforced if they are not notified?
No. Once again, as I said, see, for the proper implementation of the rules, the intent of the rules getting met, we believe, is highly desirable that in some cases we come out with standard operating procedures. The standard operating procedures is what we have, for example, with, I just saw few people, who we interact regularly in our 69A processes. Now, let me just complete, sir. So while there are clearly laid down rules, the fact is that over a period of time, the way, the day the rules were written, the way the rules are getting operated, there is a need that there is a clear understanding of these rules between the various stakeholders. And that is where, on a consultative basis, we developed the SOPs, and the same should be true this time as well.
But sir, it's not consultative then, no? Because it's not putting it up for consultation.
No. Does not mean that everything has to be put on the website, then only it should be called as consultative. So those who are the stakeholders will definitely be consulted before it is done. And then there is nothing which will remain in hidden space. There are certain limitations which we have in 69A process, but there may not be any such limitations as far as these, I should say, SOPs or FAQs may be concerned. If, as and when these SOPs or FAQ will be developed, they will once again be available in public space as well.
Fair enough. So, for me, the most important stakeholders for any government are the citizens of the country. And if they're not involved in this process, then I guess you're then giving more importance.
No, for that reason, draft rules were already published. Comments were also published. Counter comments were also published. So it's not that we did not do any consultation, but that does not mean that, we have certain timelines also to meet. So as soon as we go in for a full steam consultation, right, the fact will remain, then they will never get implemented. This is what the democracy in India is.
So one concern raised by panelists in this discussion has been that the requirement for identifying the originator would require re-architecting of global platforms. And so the 3-month time frame is a little too short. Is there any scope for expanding the time frame?
So do you agree that it's doable? First of all, do you agree that technically it's doable?
Actually, so pretty much every technical stakeholder that we've spoken with have said that it's not doable within the bounds of end-to-end encryption. And they've asked for a technology-specific consultation and at least a year. We have Debayan with us on this call. And Debayan, do you want to share your views on this?
So look, nice to meet you, Mr. Maheshwari.
Yeah.
Look, as I was saying before, while giving this airplane example, I think the government probably has good reasons for doing what it's doing. And you summarized them very nicely. The problem is when one puts forth a possible implementation like hashing, or a requirement like saying we want to trace the first originator, the government can't possibly be an expert with every single platform which are using all sorts of different technologies.
Yeah.
But once these requirements are put in place, because these are global systems and these changes will cost them, make no mistake, huge amounts of money, right? And they'll be hiring people like me. So I'll be making money off of this. So I'm quite happy in a monetary sense, but I'm very unhappy in a technical sense, because first, when such requirements are put forth, there needs to be a lot of consultation about being very, very, very precise about exactly what is required. I'm talking mathematical theorems level precise, because at the end of the day, that's what's happening on a computer.
Yeah.
Right? And when you do not have that level of precision, when you do not have those discussions before the companies are asked to follow the rules, suddenly what happens is the companies don't know what to do. In fact, some time ago when Nikhil, I'll give you word for word, he asked me, do you think this can be done in 3 months? And I gave him the actual answer, which is, I don't know, which in my opinion is a worse answer than that it can't be done in 3 months. Because
so Devanji,
if the question is precise enough that I can yes or no, that I can put a timeline on it, then it's a different question.
So Devanji, first of all, I mean, good to listen that view, but let me also tell that it's almost more than 2 years that the rules after being made, I mean, draft rules after being made public, that we are actually coming up with the final rules. Right from day one, at least one of the platform, which everybody has been talking, this requirement was put forth by the government right from day one. So it's not that it is for them to now make it. So our point is, in fact, I have 2 simple points. I mean, it's not that if it is not technically doable, then it can't be done also. But our understanding is clear. We were clear right from day one that the electronic message will have to be provided by government. So that means, and therefore, we are not at all looking at the way the encryption has been done, the way decryption is being done. We are not at all looking at it. We are only looking that at the end user device, the message does remain unencrypted. And if it is simply being forwarded, then before it is being forwarded, it is the same message, and hence the hash should remain the same. Now, how exactly it is to be done, which technical architecture to be deployed, it is best for the platform. From a legal perspective, the 2011 rules also mentioned, now also it is mentioned that there are certain expectations from the users. The user shall not be involved in doing A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z activities. Now, platform cannot take simply the shelter of it being an end-to-end encrypted platform, thereby saying that while I put these terms and conditions for the users, however, I completely remain blind to what happens on my platform. The platform, therefore, has the responsibility that while you continue to provide the privacy, work out certain mechanisms. And whatever we have done, whatever we were asking, I mean, since beginning, was also based on certain inputs made available to us. I mean, so it's not that, once again, as I said, we may be completely wrong. So there are certain assumptions with which we have gone ahead. There were certain technical inputs which were made available to us, which we also shared with the platforms. Once again, not that this is the solution, that this is also one of the possible solutions. It is, however, up to the platform, 1. 2, of course, to prevent any misuse, lots of checks and balances have already been made, particularly on this part of the sub-rule. Lots of check and balances have been made. So I do not foresee, I mean, if technically feasible, per se, the requirement, I hope, cannot be misused. I mean, given the check and balances that we have created. Lastly, we have also mentioned that if there is a better means of doing it, if there is a lesser intrusive way of doing it, as far as breach of privacy is concerned, then that lesser means will be utilized. So it is for the platforms to come up what they can offer to government for the particular condition that we do want. What was our intent? Our intent is that if there is a trouble being created in the system cannot just take the shelter of it being end-to-end encrypted and therefore be completely unaware and hence escapes out of the problem without anything being done by the platform. So we want platform to be accountable. We want people to also be accountable if they are spreading particularly some such kind of messages which are, I should say, against the sovereignty and integrity and such kind of things, or maybe which are completely denounced across the world.
So one quick clarification. When you're saying that about the hashing thing, are you assuming that I'm using WhatsApp's official, let's say, messaging platform? Because one of the biggest problems that we've been dealing with whenever we technical experts have been trying to deal with this stuff is there's no reason, suppose I'm using messaging system X, that I use their official app.
Yeah.
Right? Especially bad parties or criminal parties, and half my students can build alternative apps that, let's say to Facebook or Google or whatever, appear to be their apps, but now I can do whatever I want. I can get a message, attach a different hash to it and forward it, right? So this opens this up suddenly to this huge
So I completely agree. I completely agree. See, the rules, once again, cannot be, I mean, particularly the kind of rules that we will always have on internet will never be, will never provide 100% solution to a given problem. Okay, so we are trying to address
liability on not providing a solution to the problem.
No.
The liability exists.
Nikhilji, you will have to understand the kind of options and the kind of technological alternatives that we have to a given problem. There will always be more intelligent people. There will always be more intelligent people. There will always be people who will be able to bypass the system. So the rules are not really, rules cannot be made for those extreme cases. Rules are to be made that in general, they should be able to suffice. On internet, anything can be bypassed, whether we block, whether we ask to remove a particular thing. So whichever way, I mean, you are looking at, there can always be a bypass available. We are not exceptions, bypassing those, I mean, forgetting about those exceptions. The rule should by and large be able to meet the expectations of the government as well as, I hope, the users. In fact, the platforms with whom I have been interacting, they are mostly willing to cooperate and work with us. Once again, I believe it's therefore doable, and everybody is willing to cooperate. Yes, if 3 months of time turns out to be short for a particular sub-rule or a particular, I should say, clause of a particular sub-rule, then government will always remain open to those aberrations and, I mean, be practical about the time it takes to implement a particular process-wise solution or a technical solution or a manpower solution, whichever way it turns out.
So there's a question from Raktama in the comments saying that is sub-rule 3.2b only intended to cover revenge porn, sexual imagery, or are any deepfakes, morphed images separately covered as well?
Yeah. Separately covered as well means?
Means are they only expected to cover revenge porn and sexual imagery, or can they be extended to cover other doctored speech and things like that also?
See, one thing is, if there are two scenarios, one, something which bothers me which bothers me a lot, because it pertains about me. And therefore, we have tried to cover those scenarios wherein we have therefore given, at least from the rule perspective, a direct access. Otherwise, intermediaries are supposed to act only when the appropriate government or its agency or the court, that too for certain unlawful material. Otherwise, intermediaries have a reasonably, I should say, good amount of freedom available to them, earlier also, now also, except for such specific content which we are trying to empower the user.
So doesn't this, in effect, also partly subvert Shreya Singhal on Section 79A?
Yes, sir.
Doesn't it subvert?
Yes, sir.
It does.
Yes, sir. I agree. I agree.
So then that's legally going against the Supreme Court?
No, sir. No, sir. Once again, what we miss is the Shreya Singhal is with respect to 79(3)(b as far as Section 79 is concerned. However, the government continues to have and will have the ability to draw the due diligence as is expected at 79(2)(c). Now, this due diligence is a moving target. What is due diligence in 2011 need not be the same due diligence in 2021, and in future also this due diligence may change. Now, this due diligence is what we are trying to use to remain current to remain aware of the current problems and try to address them as much as possible.
So there's a question from Harshita, and we've been asked this multiple times. What is the logic of 50 lakhs or 5 million when we have almost 500 million social media users?
I think earlier Mr. Chandrasekhar had mentioned some response. So I'll say we have gone by a gut feeling. It's a number which you had also mentioned that based on the German Act, maybe wherein the number is 2 million, we have fixed it at 5 million. And that's how it has been fixed through a different notification, so that if at a later time the need is felt, as I said, once again, what was the aim? If we defeat our purpose, then, if the purpose is defeated, no point. So we remain open. Today, this is the number which we have fixed as a threshold. If in future, if it is felt it has to be decreased or increased, it will be accordingly done, without changing the rules.
So again, another confusion was related to this. Is there a regulatory process for determining whether an entity has more than 50 lakh?
There is no.
Is there
the whole IT Act? The whole IT Act is based on, it's a complaint-driven model.
No, sir. So how do you define 5 million users here for something to be expected to be treated as a significant social media intermediary?
Okay.
Because
so first of all, as I said,
so let me just expand. Is it 5 million registered users since inception? Is it 5 million monthly active users, which is the moving target? And we had raised this issue even on that Jan 4th meeting in 2019 about this definition of 5 million.
Okay.
How do you define 5 million?
So first of all, what we have mentioned today is that it is the 5 million registered users which will be counted to determine the threshold.
Okay.
One. Now, whether you may be inactive, you may be active user. It is for the platform maybe to come up with their policy as to what do they do with the inactive users. Active users, in any case, everybody will count them. So it's not a problem. It is problem only with respect to when you have a good amount of inactive users with them. So you now need to take a call whether you will like to continue to have them in platform, or maybe you put them out of your active numbers. And then if at all they need to come up, maybe they need to be verified, or up to you to define your policies. So some bit of policy which needs to be made clear as to what exactly do you mean by maybe an active user or maybe a user on the platform, and beyond what time maybe you will be taken off the platform, or the intermediary has the ability to take them out of their platforms. We have not specifically used the word weekly active user or daily active user or monthly active users, because this is something which is completely known and can be varying from a month to month basis for a given intermediary. So that's our basis.
So that means that anyone with more than 5 million users has to disclose that 5 million registered users will have to come to MeitY and disclose.
No, we are not asked, but we have not asked this way, but ministry has the right to ask to a particular platform if the activities of that platform fulfill the criteria of the social media platform as to whether they have their number of users above this threshold or below this threshold. We are not even interested in maybe knowing the exact numbers. However, if the need be, ministry can always ask. And that's also one of the rules, which says that maybe if the need arises, the ministry has the right to ask.
So there's a question.
But of its own, we are not registering them. We are not asking all the intermediary or all the social media intermediaries to disclose. No, we are not.
So there's a question from Peter Sihon from GitHub on this, because there's a technology platform for technologists. Saying, why was the exemption for business-oriented platforms, networking intermediaries, search engines, encyclopedia, directories, emails, and online storage, which was in the leaked draft, why was it dropped from the notified text?
Okay. So this question I'll not be able to answer as of now. But yes, it has been dropped. But once again, I will only like to mention as of now that the intent of the definition of social media remains as it was earlier. So maybe this part, therefore, we'll try to clarify through the FAQ as and when it gets published.
So, Dipanshu Maheshwari.
So I will like to therefore assure that the definition which was there, in fact, I will say not the leaked version, the definition which was there, which is presently there in the PDP bill, is what the intent of a social media platform is.
Understood, sir. So there's a question from Dipanshu Maheshwari. Did the government do any cost-benefit analysis given the huge potential cost of traceability as suggested by cryptography experts? What does the government stand to gain from this rigid insistence?
No, once again, see, it is not for government to do the cost-benefit analysis. Government has to protect its citizens. If there are lynching incidents happening, government has a right to know as to, if there is any root cause available, government has a right to know those root causes. It is for the platform to do the cost-benefit analysis. We were engaged with, at least as I mentioned, with one of the popular platform right from beginning. And we were always trying to find out possible means and ways of getting it done. But beyond that, I will again like to mention that the platforms cannot just take the shelter of the so-called encryption. We are in any case not at all breaking it or asking them to break the encryption. We are giving them the message in clear. The responsibility of the platform remains. It is up to them to find out means and ways of how it has to be done.
So there's an issue that's been raised in our discussions about the criminal liability for the chief compliance officer. Why does it need to be a criminal liability for an individual?
So first of all, once again, let me again convey that it is not the aim of these rules to have a criminal liability fixed for the chief compliance officer. The chief compliance officer has to ensure compliance to the lawful orders, the lawful requests, the lawful notifications made by the government, and to resolve any systemic failures if they are happening, or any misunderstanding which crop up time to time. This is how we are envisaging the role of Chief Compliance Officer. However, the act, at the level of act, it clearly says that the intermediaries are exempted, and the intermediaries exemptions go in certain cases. So it is at the act level and not at the rules level that the liability has become criminal or liability has become civil. So liability is already known right from the day the Act was last amended, the day the share single judgment was conveyed. So the liability has remained the same. But the aim of CCO is not to, hold and howl him, but to ensure compliance of the lawful requirement of the law and to resolve issues, because majority of the time there is a communication gap.
It's a different thing for the company and a different thing for the employee. The issue is about criminal liability for that employee potentially, which is a very different risk.
Anyway, I have conveyed my views.
So if the government is publishing FAQs, like you said, can we send questions? Can we compile questions and send for you to consider?
I'll be happy to have.
So we are happy to compile the questions. So one other question was about the reason for more time given to social media intermediaries to comply within 3 months. And so why wasn't, because this does require, and especially with the MIB related rules, why was there no time for compliance given there?
To whom?
So to news entities.
To other intermediaries.
Not just intermediaries, or even outside the ambit of intermediaries. Yeah. To the OTT streaming.
So on the MIB part, in fact, it will be MIB who will be in a best position to answer. But as regards the intermediary part, substantial change in our intermediary rule is the storage period, which in case you are storing for 90 days, you can as well store up to 180 days. And that does not require, you already are supposed to store it for next 90 days. Now onwards, so automatically, it practically means that you have 90 more days to comply with it. By that time, you have to have a mechanism to be able to store your messages for 90 more days. Or not messages, the identity, the registration details, or whatever logs you are collecting.
Okay. So then
beyond that, certain changes, of course, like acknowledgement, grievance redressal, maybe 3(2)B, the reporting of revenge porn and such other obscene material. So while the rules have immediately come into existence, we also know that practically the way people are able to come up with their requirements, and the platforms will also be able to meet to those kind of requirements, and they should also be ramped up. So it's not that all of a sudden you will have a huge demand coming. No, it doesn't happen. So it should be doable. So at any given time, it is once again the intent, because I did mention the variety of intermediary platforms that we have. You fix whatever time you want to. There will always be a class of intermediary for which it turns out to be too less or too much. So there will always be issues. Courts had always been practical. Courts will continue to be practical. Government will also have to be pragmatic. So it is expected that you ramp up in certain areas your capacity as soon as possible. For intermediaries, significant social media intermediaries, we have already given 3 months. to be able to I mean, take care of certain manpower and procedural requirements, and maybe in some cases some technical requirements.
So a question is about the chief compliance officer again. Will they go to jail for not deleting something which is legitimate or lawful under Rule 3(1)(d)? How will we put a check on frivolous 79(3)(b) requests?
So that's what I mentioned. No? Chief compliance officer's role is to ensure, to act as a bridge between the intermediary and the needs and the lawful requests of the government to address any communication gaps which does arise.
In that case, so with millions of users, isn't the 15-day timeline very short? I mean, automated responses within 24 hours, one can understand. But a 15-day timeline for an entity, let's say, has 300 million users.
Doesn't matter, sir. A 300 million user, anybody has got, will also have wherewithal. So in fact, it can be a problem for a smaller platform rather than a bigger platform. So you will always, question is simple. I mean, you know how many complaints you are likely to receive. You have received it in the past. So statistical theory always tells you. So it's a plain science. You need to have enough of capacity to be able to address. Whether you are a small platform or large platform, it doesn't really matter.
So there's a question that Malvika Raghavan had sent in, asking, she was very curious about how MeitY and Ministry of INB came together to release these rules. How did the two entities come together to release these rules?
Why can't government works together? So because two good people in two different ministries came together to be able to develop this rule jointly.
So in the Twitter case, in the few months ago, there was a disagreement, and what Twitter had argued was that there were some of the requests to remove content were unlawful from the government, or the fact that the content that was there was lawful.
Yeah.
So what if in this case is how the rights of the citizen protected if the content is lawful and the government asks to remove it under 79(3)(b)? What if the intermediary doesn't remove? Then the CCO might go to jail.
Once again, jail. So first of all, 79, and there is a difference between a 69A order and a 79.
Well, so transparency is one big difference.
Yeah, transparency is one big difference. No, transparency is there. I mean, let me tell you, even on 69A. No. I mean, I respect your views. I respect your views. I don't disagree with your views at all. But for me, we always inform the concerned platform well in advance. In fact, the law's requirement is just 1 minute, sir. Just 1 minute. The legal requirement is 48 hours, and we have instances where we have informed them in 46 hours in advance, and the platform has come back to us. No, we are getting 2 hours less. So that's the kind of transparency with which we work. The platform are always part of the discussions when the decisions are taken, the recommendations are made, except in cases of emergency. However, in such cases of emergency, the platform in any case has to be informed of the orders, has to be part of the meeting to be convened within 48 hours of the orders. And it's not that if an emergency order has been issued, the orders cannot be reversed. 1. 2, there are sometimes certain time sensitivity in certain matters. So there is a time context based, and we have therefore gone to those extent wherein if we believe after 15 days, this right now being something which is injurious to the nation or which is likely to create a public order may not be causing a public order after 15 days, we have always agreed as part of the 69A committee to review this decision after 15 days. So after 15 days, we once again take a call and we have reversed our own orders.
But sir, there is no such oversight in case of 3(1)(d) or 70.
No. There is no such oversight, and therefore And therefore, there is no such compulsion also by the intermediary to be adhering to, because I agree, I mean, that there is no such, I should say, check and balance available in 79 process. So intermediary rules process. But for that reason, there is always, the intermediaries are also at liberty not to act or to give their justification of why they are not acting.
Sir, I have
of course exposing also themselves.
I have two last questions. You've been very generous with your time. There's an anonymous attendee who's asking, what happens when orders under the IT Act under 69 are in conflict with the social media intermediaries' obligations in other countries? For instance, in case of a request for user data under 69A, where users from across geographies are concerned, social media intermediaries may have to violate laws in other jurisdictions to comply with the request. And if they don't comply,
to
use safe harbor in India.
Yeah.
How can platforms reconcile this in the global order?
Yeah. So first of all, let's be very clear as to what is the scope of IT Act.
Hanji.
So the scope of IT Act is with respect to Indians. Now, whether you are impacted because of a computer resource acting from outside India or from within India, or whether you are impacting somebody else's computer from India. So first of all, the scope of the act has to be very clear. So when we are seeking information, we are seeking, or we will be provided information with respect to an Indian user. If the user happens to be outside India, then the platform will have to follow wherever or whichever country's data maybe you happen to be asking, because you don't know where the user is. That's the beauty of, I mean, the whole internet or anonymity on the internet. So the intermediary, therefore, has refused providing certain registration information which does not fall within the jurisdiction of the country, and they ask for MLAT in that particular cases. 1. 2, when you are asking for blocking or removal, your scope is once again limited to your country, our country. So whether the platform decides to remove it globally or the platform decides to remove it within India, our requirement is you remove it within India. Rest is the platform's choice. Whether it's platform's policy or policy violation, platform will remove it globally. If it is only Indian government's or Indian laws violation, the platform will remove it within India, and we are okay with it.
Sir, one last question. If the government is okay with tracing being bypassable in some cases, as indicated earlier, tracing being bypassable in some cases. Can you hear me, sir?
No, I'm able to hear you, but I'm not able to understand the question.
Okay, so if the government is okay with tracing being bypassable, as in you could use fake versions of an app to bypass traceability, in some cases, like we had earlier spoken in the discussion, then what happens when a court case finds that finds an originator to be important? If there exists a method to bypass, then it becomes difficult to prove anything. Basically, it gives far too much. There's too much scope for like doubt. So that's basically the question, sir. I mean, there is too much doubt. So does this really solve the problem that it intends to?
देखिए बहुत बार first of all, what is our intent? What are our check and balances that we have made into the system so that this intent is per se not misused, or the facility which is being provided is not misused? Beyond this, whether it actually remains useful or not, in internet, what you define today, the situations may change very fast. This is the intent with which we have gone. This is in our rules, we have conveyed, this is what we will be sharing. This is what we will be expecting. This is when we will be invoking. And if there is an alternate means, we will be invoking the alternate means. Beyond this, In fact, I am also not really able to understand your question and probably will not be able to respond maybe to the extent you are looking for. Our intent was this.
So, you've been very, very generous with your time. Thank you so much for responding to all of these questions that we've had. We look forward to reading the SOPs or the FAQs, whichever form they take shape. So we'll collate questions from.
Yeah, please do collate. Please do collate. Please do share. If I mean, of course, the right is ours, but then we will be willing to have those questions with us, and if possible, try to answer them in FAQs. No issues.
Happy to do so. So to the attendees of this discussion, we will send across a form where they can ask the questions. Then we will remove all the redundancies and sharpen the questions and send them across for your consideration.
Yeah, and also make them anonymous.
So we will make them anonymous. So that you don't have to worry about.
So we'll try to, sir.
Great, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on this discussion. And to everyone who stayed on, thank you very much for participating. We'd like to thank all of our speakers for their valuable inputs. And we really, really appreciate your taking time out to speak with us. This video is available on YouTube, on MediaNama's YouTube channel. So in case you'd like to revisit it or you'd like to share it with someone, please feel free to do so. We appreciate the support extended by Google to us for this discussion. We've been doing a lot of work in terms of our reporting. We've had a few new people join us. Oyhik has just joined us recently. Oyhik Sur. Do check out his stories in particular on facial recognition and its deployment. Thank you for all your support. Please do subscribe to MediaNama so that we can continue to do the kind of work that we've been doing. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.